Still searching for something to help you sleep? It's all right. Some nights need a little extra help. So here's what we'll do. You relax, let the rain settle the room, and I'll walk you through 5 quiet stories at a slow, steady pace. No pressure, no rush. Story 1. Someone was confused. How I didn't recognize them. She approached me at the grocery store like we were old friends, arms already spreading for a hug before I'd even registered her face. I stepped back instinctively, and she froze, her expression cycling through confusion to hurt to something I couldn't quite name. The whole interaction took maybe 3 seconds, but it left me unsettled in ways I didn't understand. "Marcus?" she said, her voice wavering. "It's me. It's Lindsay." I searched her face for any spark of recognition. Brown hair, mid-30s, pleasant features arranged in an expression of genuine distress. She looked like someone I could have known, the kind of face that exists in the background of 100 half-remembered social gatherings. But I didn't know her. I was certain of that, as certain as I'd ever been of anything. "I'm sorry," I said, gripping my shopping basket a little tighter. "I think you have me confused with someone else. Marcus Chen, you live on Birchwood Drive. You work at Hendricks Architecture downtown." She rattled off the details like she was reading from a file, each fact correct, each one making my skin prickle with wrongness. "We've known each other for 3 years. How can you not recognize me?" I took another step back, bumping into a display of canned soup that wobbled dangerously. Other shoppers were starting to notice us, glancing over with the practiced disinterest of people who didn't want to get involved but couldn't help being curious. The woman, Lindsay, stood there with tears forming in her eyes, looking at me like I'd just told her someone had died. "I don't know you," I said, more firmly this time. "I've never met anyone named Lindsay. I don't know how you know those things about me, but I need you to leave me alone." I abandoned my basket and left the store, walked to my car on legs that felt unsteady, hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her following me. She wasn't. Just ordinary traffic, ordinary streets, an ordinary evening that had turned strange in the space of a 2-minute conversation. That night, I called my sister and described the encounter. She listened without interrupting, then asked the obvious question. Was I sure I didn't know this woman? Sometimes we meet people at parties or work events and forget them. Sometimes faces blend together, memories get fuzzy, connections slip through the cracks of an overcrowded mind. "I'm sure," I said. "I would remember her. She seemed so certain that we were close, not just acquaintances, but actual friends. You don't forget a friend." My sister agreed, suggested the woman might be mentally ill, encouraged me to call the police if she approached me again. Standard advice for a standard situation, except nothing about this felt standard. The way Lindsay had known my name, my address, my workplace, that wasn't a random delusion. That was specific information, the kind you only have about someone you've actually studied. I told myself it was probably nothing. A stalker, maybe. Or someone who'd confused me with an ex-boyfriend who looked similar. There were rational explanations, even if none of them felt quite right. I went to bed that night with the doors double-locked and the security system armed, and I dreamed of a woman's face pressing against glass, asking why I couldn't remember. 3 days later, I saw her again. I was leaving work, walking to my car in the parking garage, when I spotted her standing near the stairwell. She wasn't approaching this time, just watching, her expression sad and patient, like someone waiting for a loved one to recognize them after a long illness. When our eyes met, she raised one hand in a small wave, then turned and disappeared into the stairwell before I could react. I ran after her. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I wanted to confront her. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that she was real, and not some figment of my deteriorating sanity. The stairwell was empty when I reached it, just concrete and fluorescent lighting and the echo of my own footsteps. She'd vanished, like she'd never been there at all. That night, I searched for her online, typed Lindsay, and my city into every social media platform I could think of, scrolled through hundreds of faces that weren't hers. I tried reverse image searches, people finding websites, even dug through my own social media history looking for comments or tags from someone I might have forgotten. Nothing. No trace of a woman named Lindsay who might have known me, might have had any reason to approach me in a grocery store and act like we were old friends. But I found something else. Something that made me sit back from my computer and stare at the screen with my heart hammering against my ribs. My own Facebook timeline had gaps, whole months where I'd apparently posted nothing, shared nothing, existed as nothing but a name attached to an account I'd never noticed before. Who scrolls through their own social media history looking for holes? But now that I was looking, they were impossible to miss. 3 months in 2019, 6 weeks in 2021, another 2 months earlier this year, a span of time I could barely remember living through. I tried to recall what I'd been doing during those periods, work, presumably, daily routines, the ordinary rhythm of a life that didn't leave much room for memorable events. But the harder I focused, the fuzzier the memories became. I could remember before and after, but the gaps themselves were like trying to look at something in your peripheral vision, always sliding away when you turned toward them directly. What had happened during those missing months? And what did it have to do with a woman who knew my name, my address, my workplace? A woman who seemed genuinely devastated that I couldn't remember her? I didn't sleep well that night. Kept thinking about Lindsay's face, her confusion, the tears forming in her eyes when I'd told her I didn't know who she was. She hadn't seemed crazy. She'd seemed hurt, the way you're hurt when someone you care about fails to recognize you. But I didn't know her. I was certain of that. Wasn't I? I started keeping a journal after that. Nothing fancy, just a cheap notebook where I recorded each day's events before bed. Where I went, who I talked to, what I remembered. It felt paranoid, obsessive, the kind of thing someone does when they're losing their grip on reality. But I needed proof that my days were actually happening, that I wasn't losing more time without noticing. The journal helped. Gave me something concrete to hold on to, a paper trail of my own existence. But it also revealed something I hadn't expected. Other people had noticed the gaps too. I found out by accident during a work lunch with colleagues I'd known for years. Someone mentioned a conference in Denver, a trip the whole team had taken in spring of 2021, right in the middle of one of my blank periods. I nodded along like I remembered, but something in my expression must have given me away. "You weren't there," my coworker Paul said, frowning. "Come to think of it, you weren't around for almost 2 months that spring. Personal leave, I think. Nobody really knew what happened. You came back and acted like nothing had changed. 2 months. Personal leave I couldn't remember taking for reasons I couldn't recall. I made an excuse about a family emergency, changed the subject as quickly as I could, and spent the rest of the lunch fighting the urge to run back to my desk and tear through my email archives. The emails confirmed what Paul had said. I'd sent a message to my supervisor in March 2021, requesting 8 weeks of personal leave effective immediately. The tone was formal, almost robotic, nothing like my usual writing style. My supervisor had approved it without question, and I'd returned in May with no explanation, no follow-up, no apparent memory of where I'd been or what I'd done. I searched my apartment that night, looking for any evidence of those missing weeks. Found nothing useful, no receipts, no photos, no souvenirs from wherever I'd supposedly gone. But I did find something that made my stomach drop. A second phone, tucked into the back of my sock drawer, powered off and buried under clothes I never wore. The phone was a cheap prepaid model, the kind you buy at a convenience store when you don't want something traced. I plugged it in, waited for it to charge, and opened it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The lock screen had no passcode. The home screen had only 3 apps: phone, messages, and photos. The messages were all to the same number, saved under a single name: Lindsay. I read them with growing horror. Hundreds of texts spanning almost 3 years, Conversations that painted a picture of a relationship I had no memory of living. Inside jokes I didn't understand. Plans for dinners and movies and weekend trips. Arguments and apologies and reconciliations. The kind of intimate back and forth that only exists between people who know each other deeply. The last message was from me to her, dated 6 months ago. I need to stop. I need to forget. Please don't try to find me. And her response, sent the same day. I'll wait. I'll always wait. When you're ready to remember, I'll be here. I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of a life I couldn't recall living, and I tried to understand what I was looking at. The messages suggested I'd known Lindsay for years, not just known her, but been close to her, maybe even loved her. We'd built something together, something significant enough that she'd waited 6 months after I'd asked her to leave me alone, hoping I'd come back. But I didn't remember any of it, not the conversations, not the relationship, not even the decision to end things and forget. It was like reading about a stranger who happened to share my name and phone number. The photos were worse. There were dozens of them, selfies and candid shots spanning the same 3-year period as the messages. Me and Lindsay at restaurants, at parks, at what looked like a beach vacation I had no memory of taking. In every photo, I was smiling, really smiling, the kind of unguarded happiness I hadn't felt in years. We looked like a couple. We looked like we belonged together. And in the background of several photos, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A prescription bottle on a nightstand. Orange plastic, white cap, the kind you get from a pharmacy. I zoomed in as far as the image quality would allow, trying to read the label. Most of it was blurry, but I could make out a few words. My name, a dosage, and part of a drug name I didn't recognize. I'd been taking something. During those missing months, during the gaps in my memory, I'd been on some kind of medication I couldn't remember being prescribed. And when I'd stopped taking it, or when someone had stopped giving it to me, the memories had started to disappear. I looked up the partial drug name I'd seen on the bottle. Found a handful of possibilities, most of them benign. Blood pressure medications, cholesterol drugs, nothing that would explain memory loss on this scale. But one result caught my attention, an experimental compound still in clinical trials designed to treat PTSD by selectively suppressing traumatic memories. Memory suppression. The ability to forget things you didn't want to remember, administered in pill form. Had I been taking something like that voluntarily? Had I chosen to forget Lindsay, chosen to erase 3 years of my life because something had happened that I couldn't bear to remember? Or had someone else made that choice for me? I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. The next morning I went back to the grocery store where Lindsay had first approached me. Walked the aisles for almost an hour, hoping she'd appear again, ready to listen this time instead of running away. She didn't come. I left my phone number with the customer service desk, asked them to give it to a woman named Lindsay if she came looking for me. The clerk gave me a strange look, but agreed. 2 days later, my regular phone rang. Unknown number. I answered on the first ring. Marcus? Her voice was cautious, hopeful, afraid. You left your number. Does that mean... Do you remember now? No, I said. But I found the other phone. I found the messages and the photos. I know we knew each other, even if I can't remember it. Silence on the other end. Then, so quietly, I almost missed it. You wanted to forget. You begged me to help you forget. Are you sure you want to remember? I thought about the gaps in my timeline, the missing months, the life I'd apparently lived and then erased. Whatever I'd been running from, whatever had made me desperate enough to chemically erase my own memories. Did I really want to bring that back? But I was already drowning in a mystery I couldn't solve, already haunted by a woman I couldn't remember and a past I couldn't access. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. Yes, I said. I want to remember everything. Lindsay was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was heavy with something that sounded like grief. Then we need to meet. And Marcus, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what you're about to learn. We met at a diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where nobody looks twice at strangers having difficult conversations. Lindsay was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, her face pale and drawn in ways that made me wonder how much sleep she'd gotten since our first encounter at the grocery store. She stood when she saw me, and for a moment I thought she was going to try to hug me again. But she caught herself, sat back down, gestured to the seat across from her with a hand that trembled slightly. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." I slid into the booth, studying her face for any flicker of familiarity. Still nothing. She was a stranger to me, despite the photos on the phone, despite the messages that spanned 3 years of apparent intimacy. My brain simply refused to recognize her. "Tell me everything," I said, "from the beginning." Lindsay took a deep breath, wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to. "We met 4 years ago at a support group for people who'd experienced trauma. You'd just gone through something terrible, something you couldn't talk about, not even in the group. You sat in the back and never spoke, just listened. I noticed you because you looked the way I felt, broken in places nobody could see. I didn't remember any support group, didn't remember being broken, or at least not more broken than anyone else navigating the ordinary difficulties of life. But I let her continue, let her paint a picture of a past I couldn't access. We started talking after the meetings, coffee at first, then dinners, then more. You were guarded, but you let me in eventually. Told me things you said you'd never told anyone, about your brother, my brother." The word hit me like a physical blow, and I realized with sudden horror that I hadn't thought about my brother in months, maybe years. There was a blank space where those memories should be, a void I hadn't even noticed until she pointed at it. "I don't have a brother," I said automatically. Lindsay's eyes filled with tears. "You do. You did. His name was Kevin. He was 2 years younger than you. And he died, Marcus. He died in a way that wasn't your fault, but you couldn't stop blaming yourself." The void in my mind seemed to pulse, to press against the edges of my consciousness like something trying to break through. I felt dizzy, nauseated, my grip on the table's edge turning my knuckles white. "I don't remember any of this." "I know." Her voice was gentle, patient, the voice of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation for a long time. "That's what you wanted. You found a doctor, I don't know how, you never told me, who was running an experimental trial for memory suppression. It was supposed to help people with severe PTSD, people whose trauma was so overwhelming they couldn't function. You qualified. You more than qualified." She reached across the table, hesitated, then pulled her hand back. "The treatment was supposed to be targeted, just the traumatic memories, just the things that were destroying you. But something went wrong. The suppression spread. To Kevin, to the support group, to me. Everything connected to the trauma got erased, and that included years of your life." I sat in that diner booth, feeling the shape of a truth I couldn't remember, and I tried to understand what she was telling me. I'd had a brother. He'd died. The grief had broken me so completely that I'd volunteered to have my memories erased, and the procedure had gone wrong, taking more than it was supposed to. "Why didn't you try to stop me?" I asked. Lindsay's laugh was bitter, hollow. "I did. I begged you not to do it. Told you we'd find another way, that I'd help you carry it. But you were in so much pain, Marcus. You couldn't sleep, couldn't work, couldn't exist without feeling like you were drowning in guilt. You said the only way out was to forget. And I asked you to help me. You asked me to let you go, said that after the treatment you wouldn't remember me, wouldn't recognize me if we passed on the street. Said it was better that way. A clean break, no complications, no reminders of a life you were choosing to erase." The tears were falling now, tracking down her cheeks. "I promised to stay away. I kept that promise for 6 months. But then I saw you at the grocery store, and I couldn't just walk past you like you were a stranger. I thought about the woman at the grocery store, the hurt in her eyes, the confusion when I'd told her I didn't know her. She hadn't been crazy or obsessed. She'd been grieving, mourning a relationship I'd killed by erasing my own memory. What happened to my brother? The question came out hoarse, barely audible. How did he die? Lindsay's expression shifted, became guarded in a way that told me we were approaching the core of whatever I'd been running from. Are you sure you want to know? The doctor who treated you, the memories might come back if you're exposed to enough triggers. Once you know, you might not be able to unknow. I thought about it, really thought for the first time about what I was asking for. The photos on the phone had shown me smiling, genuinely happy in ways I couldn't remember being. But before those happy photos, there had been a support group for trauma survivors. Before the relationship with Lindsay, there had been a brother whose death had broken me so completely, I'd chosen to forget everything. Did I want to remember something like that? Did I want to bring back a grief so overwhelming it had driven me to erase my own past? I looked at Lindsay, this stranger who knew me better than I knew myself, who had loved me through something terrible and then watched me choose to forget her. She deserved better than a man who'd erased her to escape his own pain. And maybe I deserved to know what I'd done, what I'd lost, what had made me into someone capable of such a desperate act. Tell me, I said. I need to know. Lindsay closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something had hardened in her expression. The look of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. Kevin didn't just die, she said. He was killed, and you were there when it happened. You watched, and you couldn't do anything to stop it. She paused, and I felt the void in my mind begin to crack, something stirring in the darkness beyond. But that's not why you wanted to forget. You wanted to forget because afterward, after you watched him die, you found the person who did it. And you killed them, Marcus. You killed them with your bare hands. The memories came back like a dam breaking, not all at once, in fragments and flashes and moments of sudden clarity that left me gasping. Kevin's face first, young and laughing, the way he used to look at me like I had all the answers. Then older, troubled, the shadow of addiction darkening his features. Then the last time I saw him alive, in an alley behind a bar where he'd gone to meet someone who owed him money. I'd followed him that night. I remembered that now, the worry in my gut, the certainty that something bad was going to happen. I'd parked down the block and watched him walk into that alley, and I'd been too slow. Too slow to understand what was happening. Too slow to move when I saw the other man pull a knife. Too slow to do anything except watch my brother fall. The memory hit me in the diner like a physical blow. I doubled over, forehead pressed against the table, bile rising in my throat. Lindsay was saying something. My name, probably words of comfort or concern, but I couldn't hear her over the roaring in my ears. The sound of Kevin choking on his own blood while I screamed and ran toward him too late. He'd died in my arms. That memory surfaced next, unwanted and undeniable. The weight of him going slack, the light leaving his eyes, the way his hand had gripped my shirt and then released. I'd held him for what felt like hours, sobbing, begging him to stay, knowing it was already over. And then I'd looked up and seen the man who'd killed him. He was still there, still in the alley, frozen, staring at us with an expression I couldn't read. The knife was still in his hand, Kevin's blood still on the blade. He wasn't running, wasn't calling for help, just standing there, watching me hold my dead brother, like he was waiting to see what I would do. I remembered getting up, remembered the way my body moved without my permission, fueled by something deeper than thought. The man had finally started to run, but I was faster than I'd ever been, powered by a rage that burned away everything else. I caught him at the mouth of the alley, brought him down hard, And then my hands were around his throat and I was squeezing, watching his face turn red and then purple while Kevin's blood dried on my shirt. He'd struggled, clawed at my arms, kicked at my legs, made sounds that weren't quite words. But I was stronger than him in that moment, stronger than I'd ever been, and I held on until the struggling stopped, until his eyes went glassy and his body went limp and I was kneeling over a corpse in a dirty alley with my brother's body 10 feet away. I came back to the present with Lindsay's hand on my arm, her voice cutting through the flood of returning memory. Marcus, breathe. You're here, you're safe, breathe. I wasn't safe. I was a murderer. The memory was undeniable now, sharp and clear and permanent in a way it hadn't been since the treatment. I'd killed a man, watched the life drain out of him the same way it had drained out of Kevin, and I'd felt nothing but satisfaction. Nothing but the cold certainty that he'd deserved exactly what I gave him. The police, I managed. Did they? Self-defense. Lindsay's voice was steady, practiced, like she'd prepared for this question. Witnesses saw him attack Kevin first, saw you try to intervene. By the time it was over, he'd already killed your brother. The DA declined to prosecute, called it a tragedy, not a crime. A tragedy. My brother was dead, and I'd strangled his killer with my bare hands, and the legal system had called it a tragedy and moved on. But I hadn't moved on. I remembered that now, too. The months after, the sleepless nights, the way Kevin's face and his killer's face had blurred together until I couldn't close my eyes without seeing them both. The support group, I said. That's where we met. Lindsay nodded. You couldn't live with it. The guilt, the grief, the memory of what you'd done. You kept saying you could still feel his throat under your hands, could still hear the sounds he made when he died. You were falling apart, Marcus. The treatment was supposed to give you peace. Peace. I thought about the past 6 months, the life I'd been living without memory of Kevin or his death or what I'd done afterward. Had it been peaceful? I'd existed, certainly. Gone to work, paid my bills, slept through the night without dreams of blood and death. But I'd also been empty in ways I hadn't recognized until now. A shell of a person, going through motions without understanding why nothing ever felt quite real. Why did it take more than it was supposed to? I asked. The doctor wasn't sure. He said traumatic memories form networks. They connect to everything around them, people and places and feelings. When they tried to remove the trauma, they removed the connections too. Everything linked to Kevin, everything linked to what happened in that alley. She paused, her expression shifting, including me. I looked at her, this woman I'd loved and forgotten, who'd watched me choose to erase her rather than face what I'd done. The photos on the phone had shown us happy together, but that happiness had been built on the foundation of shared pain. She'd helped me through the worst time of my life, and I'd repaid her by making her a stranger. I'm sorry, I said. The words felt inadequate, laughably small against the weight of what I'd done. For forgetting you, for asking you to let me go. Don't apologize for surviving. Her voice cracked on the last word. You did what you had to do. I've never blamed you for that. But you came back. After 6 months, you came back. I couldn't help it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Loving someone doesn't stop just because they've forgotten you exist. I kept hoping maybe the treatment would wear off. Maybe you'd remember on your own. And when I saw you at the grocery store, looking right through me like I was nothing, I had to try. I had to know if there was anything left of the man I loved. I thought about the moment in the grocery store, the way I'd recoiled from her like she was a threat. She'd seen the man she loved look at her with the eyes of a stranger, and she'd kept coming back anyway. Kept hoping. Kept waiting for me to remember what we'd had. Is he still there? I asked. The man you loved, or did the treatment destroy him? Lindsay reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were warm, solid, an anchor in the storm of returning memories. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'd like to find out, if you're willing to try. I looked down at our joined hands, felt the connection I couldn't remember making but somehow still recognized. The memories were still coming, slower now, a trickle instead of a flood, and each one hurt. Each one reminded me of everything I'd lost, everything I'd done, everything I'd tried so hard to forget. But for the first time since Lindsay had approached me in that grocery store, I didn't want to run. I'm willing, I said, but there's something I need to do first. What? I met her eyes, saw the hope and fear warring in her expression. I need to visit Kevin's grave. I need to remember him properly, not just the way he died. Can you take me there? Lindsay squeezed my hand and something in her face softened. I've been waiting 3 years for you to ask that question. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon light, the kind of stillness that settles over places where the living come to remember the dead. Lindsay drove us there in her car, not speaking, letting me sit with the memories that kept surfacing like bubbles from deep water. By the time we parked at the entrance, I'd remembered Kevin's laugh, his terrible taste in music, the way he used to call me at 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep because he knew I'd always answer. I'd also remembered finding him in a hospital after his first overdose, the interventions that didn't work, the slow, grinding fear of watching someone you love destroy themselves and being powerless to stop it. Kevin's grave was in a newer section, the headstone still sharp-edged and clean. The inscription was simple, his name, his dates, beloved brother, in letters that I must have chosen but couldn't remember choosing. There were flowers at the base, fresh ones, and I realized Lindsay must have been coming here even while I'd forgotten he existed. I knelt in the grass and touched the cold stone, tracing the letters of his name with fingers that remembered holding him as he died. I'm sorry, I said. Not to Lindsay, to Kevin, to the brother I'd erased because remembering him hurt too much. I'm sorry I forgot you. I'm sorry I wasn't fast enough. I'm sorry for everything. The memories kept coming. Not just the bad ones now, the good ones too, rising up to balance the weight of loss. Teaching Kevin to ride a bike when he was 6. Watching him graduate high school, the pride on his face and mine. The night he called me crying from a payphone because he'd hit rock bottom again, and I'd driven 3 hours to pick him up without question because that's what brothers do. He'd been troubled, addicted, making choices that led him to that alley on that night. But he'd also been kind and funny and capable of a gentleness that made people want to help him even when helping seemed impossible. I'd loved him completely, the way you can only love someone whose flaws you've seen up close and chosen to forgive. And I'd killed the man who took him from me. That memory sat differently now, outside the immediacy of trauma. I could examine it, turn it over, see it from angles that had been impossible when the wound was fresh. I'd taken a life. I'd felt his throat crush under my hands, watched his eyes go dark, and I'd been glad. That was something I'd have to live with. Not the legal consequences, which had been waived, but the moral weight of knowing what I was capable of when pushed far enough. The treatment had taken that away from me, had given me 6 months of not knowing I was a person who could kill. 6 months of peace bought at the cost of everything that made me who I was. I didn't want that peace anymore. I'm not going back, I said out loud. Lindsay was standing a few feet behind me, giving me space, but I knew she could hear. To the doctor, to the treatment. I'm not erasing this again. Are you sure? Her voice was careful, non-judgmental. The memories are going to hurt. They're going to keep hurting, probably for the rest of your life. I know. I stood up, brushed grass from my knees, turned to face her. But they're mine. Kevin is mine. The good memories and the bad ones, the love and the loss. I don't want to be the person who threw all that away because it was easier than learning to carry it. Lindsay's eyes were bright with tears she wasn't letting fall. That's what I told you before the treatment, that I'd help you carry it, that you didn't have to do this alone. I wasn't ready to hear it then. I took a step toward her, then another, closing the distance I'd created when I'd chosen to forget. I think I'm ready now, if you still want to help." She laughed, a wet, broken sound that was half sob and half relief. "I've been helping this whole time, visiting his grave when you couldn't, keeping the other phone charged in case you ever went looking, waiting for you to come back to yourself." I thought about what it must have been like for her, watching me walk through the world without any memory of our relationship, of Kevin, of the person I'd been before the treatment, loving someone who didn't know she existed, the kind of faithfulness that borders on madness, sustained only by hope. "Why?" I asked. "Why didn't you just move on?" "Because I know who you really are." She reached up, touched my face with fingers that trembled. "Not the hollow version that's been walking around for 6 months. The real you, the one who held his brother while he died, and then made sure his killer couldn't hurt anyone else. The one who loved so hard that losing Kevin nearly destroyed him. That person is worth waiting for." I covered her hand with mine, felt the connection that the treatment had tried to sever but couldn't quite kill. The memories of our relationship were still fragmentary, still surfacing in pieces, but I could feel the shape of what we'd had. Something real, something worth rebuilding. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. "How to live with everything I remember now. It feels like carrying a weight I'm not strong enough for." "You don't have to be strong enough alone." She stepped closer, and I let myself feel the warmth of another person who knew the worst things about me and stayed anyway. That's the whole point. We carry it together. We stood there in the cemetery for a long time, next to my brother's grave, holding on to each other while the sun moved across the sky. The memories kept coming, slower now, integrating instead of overwhelming, and each one hurt. But each one also reminded me of who I'd been before I'd tried to erase myself. A brother, a lover, a man capable of both terrible violence and tremendous love. I couldn't undo what I'd done in that alley. Couldn't bring Kevin back. Couldn't unkill the man who'd murdered him. But I could choose to remember. Could choose to let those memories shape me instead of destroy me. Could choose to be someone who carried his scars instead of someone who pretended they'd never been wounded. Lindsay drove me home that evening. Not to my empty apartment, but to hers, the place where we'd apparently spent most of our time together before the treatment, though I only remembered it in flashes. She showed me photos I hadn't found on the burner phone, told me stories about the life we'd built, helped me fill in the gaps that the returning memories hadn't covered. It would take time, months, maybe years, to fully integrate everything I'd lost, to grieve Kevin properly, to process what I'd done to his killer, to rebuild a relationship with a woman I was only beginning to remember loving. But for the first time since Lindsay had approached me in that grocery store, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of running away. I still keep a journal, not out of paranoia anymore, out of respect for the memories I almost lost forever. Every night, I write down what I remember, about Kevin, about Lindsay, about the person I used to be and the person I'm becoming. Sometimes the entries are painful, full of grief and guilt that still feels fresh even months later. But they're mine. Every word is mine. If you ever meet someone who knows you, really knows you, and you can't remember how, don't run. Don't assume they're crazy or dangerous or confused. Consider the possibility that you're the one who's missing something. That somewhere in the blank spaces of your memory, there's a life you chose to forget. And consider whether forgetting was really the answer, or just the easiest way to avoid a harder truth. Some pain is worth carrying. Some memories, even the terrible ones, are what make us who we are. I know that now. I had to forget everything to learn it, but I know it. And I'm never going to forget again. Story 2, the old laptop that booted with someone else's profile. So, this happened about a year ago, right after I graduated college. I was 23, finally living alone for the first time in my life. And honestly, I was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. My apartment was this tiny one-bedroom in an older brick building, The kind of place with radiators that clanked and hallways that smelled vaguely like someone's grandmother's house. Not glamorous, but it was mine. I'd spent weeks hunting for a place I could actually afford on a freelance graphic designer's income, which is to say, not much. This apartment was the winner by default, slightly run down, weird layout, neighbors I never saw. But the rent was manageable, and it had good natural light for my work, and I told myself all the quirks were character. That's what you do when you're broke and desperate. You rebrand red flags as charm. The first few nights, I'll admit, I barely slept. Every creak in the hallway made me sit up in bed. Every car door outside made me flinch. But then something shifted. I started leaving my window cracked at night, just enough to hear the rain when it came. The sound of it mixed with the soft clicking of the radiator became this kind of lullaby. I'd lie there in the dark, listening to the water hitting the glass, and I'd think, I'm okay. I'm safe. This is my place. It felt like a cocoon, like nothing bad could reach me there. I should have known better. About 3 weeks after I moved in, my laptop died. Not a graceful death either. It just froze mid-project, made a sound like a dying robot, and never turned on again. I tried everything. Begged it, threatened it. Nothing. And because I'm a freelancer, no laptop meant no work, and no work meant no rent. So I did what any broke 20-something does. I went to Facebook Marketplace, found a listing pretty quick. Decent specs, good price. Seller was some guy named Derek L. His profile was sparse, just a few photos, no mutual friends, one of those accounts that exists purely for buying and selling stuff. I messaged him, we agreed to meet, and 2 days later I was standing in a coffee shop parking lot with pepper spray in my pocket, because I'm paranoid like that. You hear stories, you know? But Derek seemed fine, normal, forgettable even. He was probably mid-40s, wearing a khaki jacket that looked like it had seen better days, thinning hair combed over in a way that wasn't fooling anyone. He didn't make much eye contact, which I noticed, but didn't think much of. Some people are just awkward. He showed me the laptop, walked me through the specs, mentioned he'd already done a factory reset so it was ready to go. I handed him the cash. He handed me the laptop. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes. I remember driving home thinking I'd been smart, brought protection, met in public, got a good deal. Patted myself on the back for being a capable adult woman navigating the world. God, I was naive. Back at my apartment, I set up my little workspace by the window. Rain was just starting up outside, tapping gently against the glass. I made some tea, put on some music, felt genuinely content. This was going to be good. New laptop, new projects, new chapter. I opened it up, hit the power button, and waited for the fresh start screen to load. That's not what happened. Instead of the setup wizard, a desktop loaded. Someone's profile already logged in. The username was DLEWIS, with one of those generic default avatars, the gray silhouette. For a second, I just stared at it, confused, then annoyed. He said he'd done a factory reset. Clearly, he hadn't. Whatever. Not a big deal. I'd just create my own profile and delete his later. People forget things. People are lazy. It wasn't worth getting worked up over. I clicked around a little, mostly just curious about what kind of person this D. Lewis was. The desktop was cluttered. Folders everywhere. No organization whatsoever. Icons scattered randomly like he'd just been dumping things on the screen for years. I'm the type who keeps my desktop clean, so it gave me a little twinge of anxiety just looking at it. I was about to close everything and start fresh when something caught my eye. One of the folders wasn't labeled with a project name or a date or new folder 17 like the others. It was labeled with an address, a specific address. 1847 Berkshire Lane. My address. My building. I sat there for a second, not really processing it. Rain tapped against the window. The radiator clicked. Everything felt suddenly very still. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe he used to live here. Maybe he was a maintenance guy or worked for the property management company or had some completely reasonable explanation for having a folder named after my apartment building. There were dozens of explanations, and most of them were boring. That's what I told myself anyway, that it was probably nothing. But I opened the folder anyway. Inside were subfolders, dozens of them, all organized by apartment numbers. 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 2C, and so on, all the way up through the building. My heart did this weird little stutter in my chest, but I told myself to calm down. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe D. Lewis used to live here and kept some kind of tenant records. Maybe he worked for the property management company, or was a maintenance guy who needed to track repair requests. Boring explanations, normal explanations. Then I saw my apartment number in the list, 3A, the unit I'd moved into just 3 weeks ago. I clicked on it before I could talk myself out of it, already bracing for something terrible. But the folder was empty, just a blank white window with nothing inside. I let out this breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and actually laughed a little at myself. See? Nothing. I was being paranoid for no reason, letting my imagination run wild because I lived alone now and every little thing felt magnified. The folder probably auto-generated somehow, or he'd started organizing something and never finished. It meant nothing. I almost closed the whole thing right then. Almost went back to setting up my own profile and forgetting any of this existed. But I was curious now, in that way you get when something doesn't quite add up. I told myself I'd just peek at one more folder, just to confirm this was all mundane property management stuff, and then I'd move on with my life. I clicked on 3B, my next-door neighbor. I'd seen her a few times in the hallway. A woman in her mid-30s, always seemed to be in a rush, usually had her phone pressed to her ear. We'd exchanged exactly one hi in the 3 weeks I'd lived there. The folder was not empty. There were photos, dozens of them, organized into dated subfolders going back months. I opened one at random, and my stomach dropped. It was her, my neighbor, walking across the parking lot to her car. A normal enough image, except for the angle. It was taken from a distance, slightly zoomed, clearly without her knowledge. I clicked to the next one. Her again, this time checking the mailbox in the lobby. Then another. Her silhouette visible through her apartment window at night, the curtains not quite closed all the way. The photos were time-stamped in the file names, organized chronologically, documented like some kind of sick research project. My hands had started shaking at some point. I don't remember when exactly, but I noticed them trembling against the trackpad as I clicked out of that folder and into another. Apartment 4A, different woman, same thing. Candid photos taken from a distance through windows in parking lots at the mailboxes. This woman was older, maybe late 40s, and there were notes in her folder too. Actual text documents with her daily schedule written out. Leaves for work 7:15 a.m., returns 5:30 to 6 p.m. Husband travels frequently, alone most weeknights. I felt like I was going to be sick, actually physically sick. Like the nausea was rising up from somewhere deep in my gut, but I couldn't stop clicking. Folder 2, C. A younger woman, maybe my age, photographed jogging in the morning, photographed coming home with groceries, photographed through what looked like her bedroom window. Folder 1B, an older woman with gray hair, lived alone, had a small dog. He'd noted the dog. He'd noted that the dog was small and not a deterrent. The rain was coming down harder outside now. I could hear it hammering against the window, but it didn't sound peaceful anymore. It sounded like static, like white noise filling up my head while I tried to process what I was looking at. This wasn't property management. This wasn't maintenance records. This was a man systematically watching, documenting, and studying the women in my building. I found more text documents as I clicked through, detailed notes about routines, about vulnerabilities, about access points. One woman's file mentioned that her bedroom window faced the alley and was ground floor, easy access, no security light. Another noted that she worked night shifts and the apartment was empty from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. He was cataloging them, rating them, planning something. I slammed the laptop shut and pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to breathe. The radiator clicked steadily in the corner, indifferent. Rain pounded the glass. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I needed to call the police. I needed to call someone. This was evidence of, I didn't even know what. Stalking. Predatory surveillance. Maybe worse. Maybe things that hadn't happened yet but were being planned. But before I did anything, I needed to know one thing. My folder had been empty, but it existed. He'd created a folder with my apartment number. I needed to know when. I opened the laptop again, my fingers clumsy on the trackpad, navigated back to my folder, 3A, and right-clicked on it, selecting Properties. A little window popped up with the folder details. Creation date, October 29th. That was 2 weeks before I bought this laptop. 5 days after I moved into this apartment. He'd started a file on me. He'd been watching long enough to know someone new had moved in, and he'd created a folder for me, ready to fill it with photos and notes and schedules, just like all the others. The only reason it was empty was because he'd tried to wipe the laptop before selling it. He'd screwed up, and now I was sitting here, alone in my apartment, holding every piece of evidence he'd ever collected. Which meant if he ever realized his mistake, he would come back for it. For a long moment, I just sat there staring at the screen, my mind racing through possibilities. This man, Derek D. Lewis, whatever his real name was, knew where I lived. He knew this building intimately, knew which windows faced which directions, knew the routines of the women who lived here. He'd been inside this building, probably multiple times, close enough to photograph through windows and document schedules. And I had just bought his laptop, the one containing every piece of evidence of what he'd been doing. The question that kept circling in my head was whether selling it to me had been an accident or something intentional. I tried to think back to the parking lot exchange, searching my memory for anything that seemed off. He hadn't made much eye contact, I'd noticed that. But I'd chalked it up to awkwardness, to him just being one of those socially uncomfortable guys who didn't like talking to strangers. Now I wondered if it was something else. Was he distracted? Nervous? Was he thinking about what was on this laptop while he handed it over to me? Or worse, was he sizing me up, already planning to add me to his collection? The rational part of my brain, the part that wasn't spiraling into panic, told me to focus. I needed more information. I needed to know who this guy actually was before I went to the police, so I could give them something concrete. I started clicking through the laptop more methodically, looking for anything that might identify him. Emails, documents, browser bookmarks, anything with a real name or address attached. I found an email client buried in the applications folder. Most of it was empty or filled with spam, newsletters he'd never unsubscribed from, shipping notifications for packages long since delivered. But there was a drafts folder with one unsent message sitting in it, dated the day before I'd bought the laptop. It was addressed to himself, like a note or a reminder, and when I opened it, my blood went cold. Need to get new drive, getting sloppy, evidence piling up. Should have been more careful with 2C. Wipe everything before the move. Start fresh somewhere else. I read it 3 times, trying to absorb what I was seeing. He knew. He knew he was being careless, knew he had too much evidence accumulated, knew he needed to destroy it. Should have been more careful with 2C. I thought of the young woman in that folder, the one photographed through her bedroom window, and my stomach turned. What did more careful mean? What had he done? The email mentioned a move, starting fresh somewhere else. He was leaving. He was planning to wipe everything and disappear to some other building, some other group of women who had no idea what was coming. But he'd screwed up. He'd sold me the laptop without properly wiping it, and now I was holding everything. Every photo, every schedule, every note about access points and vulnerabilities. If he figured out what had happened, if he realized his mistake, he would need to get this back. He would need to make sure no one ever saw what was on this drive. As if the universe had heard my thoughts, my phone buzzed on the desk beside me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The screen lit up with a text message from an unknown number, and for a second, I just stared at it, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and read the message. "Hey, this is Derek. Sold you the laptop. Quick question. Did it boot up okay? Factory reset work?" He was checking. He remembered. Somewhere out there, maybe close by, maybe miles away, he was thinking about that laptop and wondering if his mistake had been discovered. I put the phone face down on the desk without responding, like not looking at it could somehow make this less real. My mind was screaming at me to do something. Call the police, call a friend, get out of the apartment. But my body felt frozen, locked in place by a fear so intense it was almost paralyzing. The rain was still coming down hard outside, drumming against the window in a relentless rhythm that suddenly felt less like comfort and more like isolation, like it was sealing me inside with whatever was about to happen. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. They were slow, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belong to someone who isn't in a hurry. I held my breath, listening as they grew closer, counting the seconds between each one. The building was old. I'd learned which floorboards creaked and where, had memorized the sounds of my neighbors coming and going. These footsteps didn't sound like Mrs. Patterson from 3B rushing home from work. They didn't sound like the guy from 3C who always took the stairs 2 at a time. They sounded careful, measured. They stopped right outside my door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I sat there staring at the door like I could see through it, every muscle in my body locked tight. The silence stretched out, broken only by the rain and the faint clicking of the radiator. I thought I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination filling in the gaps. 10 seconds passed, 20. It felt like an hour. Then the footsteps moved on, continuing down the hallway until I heard a door open and close somewhere at the end of the corridor. Just a neighbor, just someone coming home. I let out the breath I'd been holding in a shaky rush, but the relief only lasted a second before my phone buzzed again. I looked at the screen, 2 new messages from the same unknown number. Hello? And then, 30 seconds later, just want to make sure everything's working. He was waiting for a response, getting impatient. I could almost picture him somewhere out there, staring at his phone, watching for the little dots that would tell him I was typing. I set the phone down again and pressed my hands flat against the desk to stop them from shaking. Another buzz, another message. Actually, I think I left some personal files on there. Mind if I swing by and grab them real quick? Shouldn't take long. Swing by. He wanted to swing by. He knew where I lived because of course he did. He'd been documenting this building for months. And now he wanted to come here, to my apartment, alone with me, to retrieve the evidence of everything he'd done. My throat felt like it was closing up. The rain hammered against the window like a warning, and I realized with sudden, horrible clarity that I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I had to get out. The next few minutes felt like moving through water, everything slow and heavy and wrong. I knew I needed to get this laptop to the police. It was evidence, real evidence of crimes committed against women who had no idea they were being watched. But I also knew I couldn't just show up empty-handed with a story about a creepy guy from Facebook Marketplace. I needed to make a copy. I needed backup in case something happened to the laptop, in case he somehow got it back, in case everything went sideways, and this was the only proof that any of this was real. I dug through my desk drawer with shaking hands, pushing aside pens and sticky notes and old chargers until I found a USB drive at the bottom. It was an old one, maybe 32 gigs, but it would have to be enough. I plugged it into the laptop and started dragging folders over. The whole building directory, every apartment file, every photo and document and piece of damning evidence I could find. A progress bar appeared on screen, crawling forward with agonizing slowness. 12%, 19%, 24%. My phone buzzed again, and I flinched so hard I nearly knocked it off the desk. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The screen showed another message from the unknown number. I'm actually in the area. Could be there in like 10 minutes. My chest tightened. 10 minutes. He could be here in 10 minutes, and I was sitting here watching a progress bar inch forward while rain pounded against the windows and the radiator clicked its steady, indifferent rhythm. 31%. 38. I stared at the screen like I could will it to move faster, every second stretching out into an eternity. Another buzz from my phone. It's kind of important. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. My hands were trembling too badly to type even if I'd wanted to, and what would I even say? Sorry, busy copying all the evidence of your stalking before you come murder me? 46%. 52. The hallway outside my apartment was silent except for the rain. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to hear those slow, deliberate footsteps again, half expecting a knock that would shatter whatever fragile composure I was still clinging to. 59%. 63. My phone buzzed one more time, and I looked at it with a kind of numb dread, already knowing it would be bad. I know you're there. 4 words. Just 4 words. But they hit me like a physical blow. I know you're there. Not, are you there? Or, hello? He knew. He was certain. Maybe he was watching the building right now, had seen my light on, had tracked me somehow through the laptop itself. Maybe he'd been watching all along, had never really stopped, and selling me the laptop was just another move in some sick game I didn't understand. The progress bar showed 71%, and I wanted to scream at it. Wanted to throw the laptop across the room. Wanted to do anything except sit here feeling like prey. 78%. 84. 89. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door and shoved them in my jacket pocket. Found my pepper spray in my purse and gripped it so tight my knuckles went white. The progress bar hit 93%, and I started putting on my shoes, not even bothering to untie them, just jamming my feet in and stomping down the backs. 97, 99, 100. The copy was done. I yanked the USB drive out and shoved it deep in my pocket, then grabbed the laptop and stuffed it into my bag. I didn't know if I'd need both, didn't know what the police would want, didn't know anything except that I had to get out of this apartment right now, this second, before he got any closer. I went to the door and stopped with my hand on the knob, suddenly paralyzed by a new fear. What if he was already here? What if he hadn't really been 10 minutes away? What if that was a lie to make me let my guard down? What if he was standing in the hallway right now, waiting for me to open the door? I pressed my eye to the peephole, heart slamming against my ribs, and scanned the fisheye view of the corridor outside. Yellow lighting, stained carpet, that ugly wallpaper the landlord had never bothered to replace. Empty. The hallway was empty. But the stairs were at the far end, a good 30 feet away, and between here and there were doorways and corners and shadows where someone could be waiting. I thought about calling the police from inside the apartment, letting them come to me, staying behind a locked door until help arrived. But my door was old, the lock was flimsy, and if Derek decided he didn't want to wait, I didn't trust that thin piece of wood to stop him. I didn't want to be trapped. I didn't want to be cornered. I took a breath that didn't quite fill my lungs and opened the door. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, silent and still. I could hear the rain against the window at the far end, could see it streaking down the glass in silver lines. I walked fast, not quite running, but close, my bag bumping against my hip and my keys digging into my palm where I'd wrapped my fist around them. Past 3B, my neighbor's door, the woman from the photos, probably home right now watching TV without any idea that a man had been cataloging her life for months. Past the supply closet with its perpetually broken lock. Past the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall that I'd never really noticed before. The stairwell door was heavy, and it groaned when I pushed it open. I took the stairs as fast as I could without falling, my footsteps echoing in the concrete space, one hand on the railing and the other clutching my pepper spray. First floor. Ground floor. The side exit that led to the parking lot. the one I almost never used because it stuck and you had to really shove it. I hit the door with my shoulder and burst out into the rain. It was cold, the kind of cold that soaks through your clothes in seconds and settles into your bones. My car was maybe 20 feet away, sitting under the one working light in the lot, and I ran for it like my life depended on it because maybe it did. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them on the wet asphalt, picked them up with numb fingers and jabbed at the unlock button until the lights flashed. I yanked open the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and hitting the lock before I'd even caught my breath. For a moment, I just sat there, rain hammering on the roof, my chest heaving, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I scanned the parking lot through the water-streaked windows looking for a figure, a car I didn't recognize, any sign that he was here, that he was watching, that he was coming for me. I didn't see anything. Just rain and shadows and the orange glow of the parking lot light. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot without looking back. The police station was maybe 15 minutes away, and I drove there with my heart in my throat and my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, watching for headlights that might be following. The rain made everything blurry, turned the streetlights into smeared halos, and the whole drive felt like a fever dream, like I'd fallen into someone else's nightmare and couldn't find my way out. I walked into the police station soaking wet, shaking, probably looking like I'd completely lost my mind. The officer at the front desk gave me this look, half concern, half wariness, and asked if I was okay. I told him I wasn't, that I needed to report something, that I had evidence of crimes against multiple women, and I didn't know what to do with it. He must have seen something in my face that told him I wasn't exaggerating because he didn't ask any more questions. He just led me to a room in the back and told me someone would be with me shortly. A detective came in about 10 minutes later, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with reading glasses, pushed up on her head, and a coffee cup that looked like it had been refilled too many times. I told her everything. The Facebook Marketplace listing, the parking lot exchange, the laptop that hadn't been wiped, the folders organized by apartment number, the photos and schedules and notes about access points. I showed her the laptop, walked her through the file structure, let her click through a few of the folders herself. I watched her face as she looked at the photos, watched the way her expression shifted from professional skepticism to something harder, something angrier. She stopped on one of the text documents, the one about the woman in 2C with the notes about her bedroom window, and I saw her jaw tighten. She asked me about the text messages, and I handed over my phone so she could see them. The whole exchange was still there, his casual tone at first, then the increasing pressure, then that final message that still made my skin crawl. I know you're there. She photographed everything with her own phone, took notes in a little spiral notebook, asked me questions I didn't always have answers to. What did he look like exactly? Did I remember what kind of car he was driving? Had I noticed anyone following me in the weeks since I'd moved in? I told her what I could, but so much of it was fuzzy, half-remembered, contaminated by the panic that had been flooding my system for the past few hours. They kept the laptop. They kept the USB drive too, as backup. The detective told me they'd be in touch, that they'd look into the women in the photos, that they'd try to track down Derek Lewis through the Marketplace listing and the phone number. She also told me, gently but honestly, that these cases were difficult, that fake names and burner phones made people hard to find, that unless he did something overt, something they could catch him in the act of doing, it might be hard to make anything stick. I nodded like I understood, but inside I felt hollow. I'd handed them everything, every piece of evidence he'd ever collected, and it still might not be enough. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. I called my friend Sarah from the parking lot of the police station, rain still coming down around me, and told her I needed somewhere to stay. She didn't ask questions, just gave me her address and said she'd leave the light on. I drove there in a daze, let her wrap me in a blanket and make me tea I didn't drink, and eventually fell asleep on her couch with all the lights still on because I couldn't stand the thought of being in the dark. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and jumping at shadows. I went back to my apartment exactly once, and only because Sarah came with me. We packed up everything I owned in about 3 hours, shoving clothes into garbage bags and throwing books into boxes without any kind of organization. I didn't care about being neat. I just wanted to be gone. I broke my lease and paid the fee without arguing, even though it wiped out most of my savings. It didn't matter. I couldn't stay in that building knowing what I knew, knowing that he'd walked those hallways, stood outside those windows, watched and documented and planned. I moved back in with my mom for a while, which felt like failure and relief, all tangled up together. She didn't push me to explain, just let me sleep in my old room and eat dinners I barely tasted, and slowly, painfully, start to feel like a person again. The nightmares were bad at first. I kept dreaming about footsteps in hallways, about progress bars that never reached 100%, about opening doors to find someone standing on the other side. Eventually they faded, but they never went away completely. Even now, a year later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, convinced I heard someone outside my window. The police contacted me a few times in the months after I filed my report. They'd identified some of the women in the photos and reached out to them, which I guess was something. I tried not to think too hard about what those conversations must have been like. Finding out a stranger had been documenting your life, photographing you through your windows, noting when you were home alone and which locks would be easy to break. The detective told me they were following leads on Derek, but something in her voice told me they weren't close. The Facebook profile had been deleted. The phone number was disconnected. Whoever he really was, he'd vanished like smoke. That was 8 months ago. I never heard anything else. I have a new apartment now, in a different city, in a building with a doorman and security cameras and locks that actually work. I factory reset every device I buy, and then I do it again just to be sure. I check my windows at night before I go to sleep, and I always look through the peephole before I open my door. These are just habits now, little rituals that help me feel like I have some control over my own safety. I know they're probably not enough. I know that if someone really wanted to find me, really wanted to watch me the way he watched those other women, a deadbolt and a security camera wouldn't stop them. But it's something. It's the best I can do. I still think about him sometimes, usually late at night when the rain is coming down and the world feels quiet and small. I wonder where he went after he realized his mistake. Whether he really did start fresh somewhere else, like his email said. I wonder if there's another building full of women being watched right now, their routines cataloged, their vulnerabilities noted, and they have no idea. I wonder if the police ever got close, or if he's still out there, still careful, still patient. And I wonder, more than anything, whether selling me that laptop was really an accident. Maybe he got sloppy, like he said in that email. Maybe he made a mistake, and I just happened to be the one who found it. But sometimes, in the dark, I wonder if he wanted me to see. If leaving those files was intentional, some kind of message or warning or sick little game. If he's out there right now, thinking about the girl who bought his laptop and found his secrets, wondering what she did with them, I'll never know for sure. And honestly, that's the part that still keeps me up at night. Not what I found, but what I'll never understand. The rain doesn't sound the same to me anymore. It used to feel like safety, like a cocoon, like nothing bad could reach me. Now it just sounds like white noise, like static, like cover for the things that move in the dark, watching and waiting, patient as stone. Story 3, The Stranger Who Waited Outside the Grocery Store. I used to love closing shifts. I know that sounds weird. Most people hate working until midnight, hate the empty aisles and the fluorescent lights and the slow creep of exhaustion that settles in around hour 6. But there was something peaceful about it for me. The store got quiet after 10, just a handful of late-night shoppers drifting through, and my manager would let us put music on the overhead speakers once the crowds thinned out. I'd stock shelves, mop floors, zone out to whatever playlist Marcus had queued up that night. It was meditative, almost. The kind of work where you can let your brain go on autopilot and just exist for a while. I was 19 that year, taking a gap year after high school because I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and college felt like an expensive way to figure it out. I'd moved into an apartment with two guys I'd known since middle school, Trevor and Danny, and we were all working random jobs, splitting rent 3 ways, pretending we had everything under control. The grocery store gig wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent, and the hours worked for me. I'd clock in at 4, work until midnight, walk the 20 minutes home through our quiet little suburban neighborhood, and fall asleep watching whatever was on TV. It was a routine. It was comfortable. The walk home was my favorite part, honestly. Late November, the air had that clean, cold bite to it, and the streets were always empty by the time I got off. I'd put my earbuds in, pull my hoodie up against the chill, and just decompress from 8 hours of customer service smiles and paper or plastic. The route took me past a strip mall that closed at 9, through a residential stretch with big oak trees that had already dropped most of their leaves, and then down Maple Street to our apartment complex. Street lights every 50 feet or so, enough to see by but dim enough that the stars were still visible if you bothered to look up. I liked the quiet. I liked being alone with my thoughts after a whole shift of small talk and forced friendliness. I'd been working there about 4 months when I first noticed him. It was a Tuesday night, I remember, because Tuesdays were always dead and Marcus had left early, which meant I was closing with just me and this older woman named Linda who worked the registers. We finished up around 12:15, a little later than usual because some kid had knocked over an entire display of pasta sauce in aisle 7 and I'd spent 20 minutes cleaning up glass and marinara. Linda headed out to her car while I locked the side door, and that's when I saw him. A man standing at the far edge of the parking lot, right where the lights didn't quite reach, just standing there. Not walking anywhere, not getting into a car, not doing anything except existing in that one spot like he was waiting for something. I didn't think much of it at first. People are weird. Maybe he was waiting for a ride. Maybe he was on the phone. Maybe he just liked standing in dark parking lots at midnight for reasons I couldn't understand. I finished locking up, gave him one more glance, he hadn't moved, and started my walk home. The cold air felt good after the stuffiness of the store, and by the time I reached the strip mall, I'd mostly forgotten about him. Just another strange detail in a night full of small, forgettable moments. The second time was 4 days later, Saturday night. Saturdays were busier, more bodies in the store, more chaos to manage, and by the time midnight rolled around, I was exhausted in a way Tuesdays never made me. I walked out the side door with Marcus and one of the cashiers, a girl named Becca, who always parked next to the dumpsters for some reason. And there he was again. Same spot, same posture, same absolute stillness, like a mannequin someone had placed there as a joke. Marcus noticed him too, said something like, "That guy's creepy as hell," but we all just laughed it off and went our separate ways. I started my walk home, and I told myself it was a coincidence. 2 times didn't mean anything. Maybe he worked nearby, maybe he was homeless, and that was his spot. Maybe there were a dozen explanations that didn't involve anything sinister. But I looked back over my shoulder 3 times on the walk home that night, and each time, the street behind me was empty. The 3rd time was the following Wednesday, and that's when the feeling started. You know the one I mean. That prickle at the back of your neck, that weight in your stomach, that quiet voice in your head that says something is wrong even when you can't explain why. I came out of the store alone that night. Marcus had already left and Linda was on vacation, and he was there, same spot. But this time, when I looked at him, I could have sworn he was looking back. It was too dark to see his face clearly, too far away to make out any features, but I felt it. That specific, uncomfortable sensation of being watched, being studied. I walked home faster than usual, my hands shoved deep in my pockets and my music turned off so I could hear if anyone was behind me. The streets were empty, the night was quiet, nothing happened. But when I got to my apartment and locked the door behind me, my heart was pounding like I'd been running, and I stood there in the dark for a long moment, just listening. Trevor was asleep on the couch with the TV on, some late-night infomercial casting blue light across the room. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 3 sightings over 2 weeks didn't mean anything, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. That was the last night I walked home without looking over my shoulder every 30 seconds. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. People have routines, right? Maybe this guy worked a late shift somewhere nearby. Maybe he got off at the same time I did, and that parking lot was just where he waited for his ride. There were logical explanations, boring explanations, and I repeated them to myself like a mantra every time that uneasy feeling crept back in. I even mentioned it to Trevor one morning, trying to keep my voice casual while I poured cereal into a bowl. Told him there was this weird guy who kept showing up outside my work. Trevor just shrugged and said, probably homeless, without looking up from his phone, and I let it drop. He was probably right. I was probably making something out of nothing, but then the stranger started showing up in other places. The first time was about a week later, on my day off. I'd walked to the gas station a few blocks from our apartment to grab some snacks, and when I came out with my bag of chips and energy drink, I saw him across the street. He was standing on the sidewalk in front of a closed dry cleaner, hands in his pockets, facing my direction. It was the middle of the afternoon, broad daylight, people driving past, and somehow that made it worse instead of better. At night, in a dark parking lot, you can tell yourself you didn't see clearly, that the shadows played tricks on you. But in the afternoon sun, there was no mistaking it. Same build, tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", with a lean frame that made him look even taller. Same posture, that weird stillness like he was conserving energy, like moving was something he only did when absolutely necessary. I couldn't see his face clearly from that distance, but I knew it was him. I knew it the way you know when someone's staring at you from across a crowded room. You just feel it. I walked home the long way that day, taking a route that looped around the block and approached our apartment from the opposite direction. It added 10 minutes to a 5-minute walk, but I didn't care. I kept checking behind me the whole way, and I didn't see him following. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the question that kept circling in my head. How did he know where I'd be? The grocery store was one thing. That was predictable. I worked there 5 nights a week. But the gas station on my day off? That wasn't routine. That wasn't a pattern he could have figured out, unless he'd been watching me more closely than I realized. The sightings started coming faster after that, like he'd stopped being careful about letting me see him. I spotted him outside the laundromat where I did my weekly wash, just standing on the corner like he was waiting for a bus that never came. I saw him in the parking lot of the fast food place where Danny worked, even though I'd only stopped by to give Danny a ride home and hadn't planned on being there for more than 5 minutes. Once, I could have sworn I saw him walking on the opposite side of the street while I was inside my apartment, and when I pressed my face to the window to get a better look, he was gone. Vanished, like he'd never been there at all, and I stood there for a long time wondering if I'd imagined it. I started changing my routines, taking different routes home from work, leaving at slightly different times, varying which door I used to exit the store. It didn't help. No matter what I did, no matter how unpredictable I tried to be, I'd catch a glimpse of him somewhere. A tall figure at the edge of my vision, a silhouette that didn't move when everyone else was walking. He was always too far away to confront, always in spots where approaching him would feel crazy, paranoid, like I was the one being aggressive, and he never did anything. That was the part that messed with my head the most. He just watched. He just waited. He just existed in my periphery like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I finally told Danny and Trevor the whole story one night. All 3 of us sitting around our tiny living room with the TV muted and rain tapping against the windows. I laid it out, the parking lot, the gas station, the laundromat, all of it, and watched their faces shift from amusement to something more uncertain. Danny asked if I'd gotten a good look at the guy's face, and I admitted I hadn't. Not really. Too far away every time, or the light was wrong. where he was turned at an angle that hid his features. Trevor asked if I'd called the cops, and I laughed bitterly and asked him what I'd even say. There's a man who stands in public places and doesn't do anything illegal. They'd think I was insane. Hell, half the time I thought I was insane. But Danny didn't laugh. He got this serious look on his face and said, maybe I should start driving to work instead of walking, at least until this blew over. Trevor nodded slowly, like the idea hadn't occurred to him until Danny said it out loud. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof, filling the silence between us. I told them I didn't have a car, and Danny said I could borrow his. He barely used it anyway. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist I was overreacting, and this was all probably nothing. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, in that place where instinct lives, I knew this wasn't nothing. I knew this man, whoever he was, had chosen me for something. I just didn't know what yet. I borrowed Danny's car the next day. An old Honda Civic with a tape deck and a passenger door that didn't lock right. It felt good to have metal and glass between me and the world, to not be exposed on those dark streets with nothing but a hoodie and my own 2 feet. I drove to work, drove home, kept the doors locked, and the windows up even when the car got stuffy. For 3 days, I didn't see him. For 3 days, I let myself believe that maybe it was over, that maybe he'd gotten bored or found someone else to fixate on, that maybe I'd scared him off just by changing my routine enough. On the 4th night, I came out of work at 12:15 and found him standing next to Danny's car. He was just leaning against the driver's side door, arms crossed, like he was waiting for an old friend. The parking lot lights didn't reach that corner of the lot, but I could see his outline clearly enough. Tall, still, patient. And for the first time, I could see his face, or at least the shape of it. Pale skin, dark hair, slicked back, or maybe just wet from the mist that had been falling all evening. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not a, hey, good to see you, smile. Something else. Something that made my stomach drop and my legs go weak. I didn't go to the car. I turned around and walked back into the store, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the lock. I called Danny from the break room and told him to come get me, told him to bring Trevor, told him I couldn't explain right now, but I needed them there. Then I sat in the corner with all the lights on and waited, watching the door like something might come through it at any moment. Danny and Trevor showed up 20 minutes later, both of them looking half asleep and confused. I met them at the front entrance, not willing to go back out the side door where the parking lot waited, and I told them what happened in a rush of words that probably didn't make much sense. The man at the car, the smile, the way he'd been leaning there like he owned the place, like he'd been waiting for me specifically, like he knew exactly which car I'd be walking toward. Trevor's face went tight, and he asked where exactly I'd seen him, and when I pointed toward the far corner of the lot, all 3 of us looked. The space next to Danny's car was empty. The stranger was gone. We walked over together anyway, Trevor holding his phone with the flashlight on, Danny with his keys clenched in his fist like a weapon. The car looked untouched. No scratches, no notes tucked under the windshield, no sign that anyone had been there at all. For a second I wondered if I'd hallucinated the whole thing, if the stress and lack of sleep had finally cracked something loose in my brain. But then Danny pointed at the driver's side window and said, "What's that?" And my stomach turned to ice. There was a handprint on the glass. A perfect, clear handprint pressed against the window from the outside, fingers splayed wide like someone had been leaning close, trying to look in. The mist had gathered around the edges of it, making it stand out against the dark interior of the car. Someone had been here. Someone had been pressed right up against this window, maybe minutes ago, maybe while I was inside calling for help. Trevor took a picture of the handprint with his phone, and we all got in the car without another word. Danny drove, I sat in the back, and none of us spoke until we were 3 blocks away from the grocery store. Then Trevor turned around in his seat and told me I needed to file a police report, that this had gone beyond weird into something actually dangerous. I knew he was right. I'd known it for a while, probably, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't paranoia. A man had tracked my movements, learned my routines, figured out which car I was using, and waited for me in the dark with a smile on his face. That wasn't nothing. That was something very, very wrong. I went to the police station the next morning, sat in a hard plastic chair for 45 minutes, and then explained everything to an officer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I told him about the parking lot sightings, the gas station, the laundromat, the man leaning against my friend's car. I showed him the picture of the handprint. He nodded along, took some notes, and asked if the man had ever threatened me directly, ever said anything to me, ever made any explicit statements about what he wanted. I said no, he'd never spoken to me, never gotten close enough to speak, just watched and waited and smiled that one time. The officer's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pity. He told me that without direct threats or criminal behavior, there wasn't much they could do. I could file a report, which I did, but unless the man actually did something illegal, their hands were tied. "Keep documenting," he said. "If it escalates, come back." If it escalates, like waiting outside my workplace and pressing his face against my car window, wasn't escalation enough. I drove home feeling hollowed out, like something important had been scooped out of my chest and replaced with cold air. The rational part of my brain understood the officer's position. You can't arrest someone for standing in public places, but the rest of me wanted to scream. This man was hunting me. I could feel it in my bones, in that ancient animal part of the brain that recognizes predators even when you can't explain why. And the people who were supposed to protect me couldn't do anything until he'd already hurt me. I was on my own. The next few days were quiet in a way that made me more nervous, not less. I didn't see the stranger anywhere, not at work, not around the apartment, not lurking in parking lots or standing on street corners. Part of me hoped he'd finally given up, moved on to someone else, or gotten scared off by my police report. But a bigger part of me knew better. He wasn't gone. He was just waiting, recalculating, figuring out his next move while I sat around jumping at shadows and checking over my shoulder every 5 seconds. On the 5th night, I found out I was right. I was sitting in my bedroom, half watching something on my laptop with the sound turned low, when I heard Danny's voice from the living room. He was saying my name, not shouting, but loud enough to carry through the thin walls, and something in his tone made me get up immediately. I found him standing by the front window, the curtains pushed aside just enough to see out, and his face was pale in the blue glow of the streetlight. He pointed without saying anything, and I looked. The stranger was standing across the street, directly in front of our apartment building. He was under the big oak tree that had dropped most of its leaves, half in shadow and half in the orange cone of a streetlight, and he was looking up at our windows, not moving, not hiding, just standing there in the open, letting us see him, letting us know that he knew where we lived. I felt something cold run down my spine, a physical sensation like ice water trickling between my shoulder blades, and for a long moment I couldn't breathe. He'd found my home, the one place I was supposed to be safe, the one place I could lock the doors and shut out the world, and he'd found it. Trevor called the cops while I stood frozen at the window, watching the stranger watch us. He didn't leave. He didn't seem concerned about the possibility of police showing up. He just stood there under that tree with his hands in his pockets and his face tilted up toward our second-floor unit, patient as death. By the time the patrol car rolled down our street, maybe 15 minutes later, he was gone, vanished into the night like he'd never been there. The officers did a loop around the block, shined their flashlights into some bushes, told us to call again if he came back. Then they left, and we were alone again, staring at the empty spot under the oak tree where a man had stood and watched us like prey. None of us slept that night. We sat in the living room together with all the lights on, taking turns checking the window, waiting for morning to come. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, broken only by the occasional car passing on the street below. At some point, Danny said maybe we should move, find a new apartment, put some distance between us and whoever this guy was. Trevor said that was crazy, that we couldn't just uproot our lives because of one creep. But I could hear the fear underneath his words, the same fear that was sitting in my chest like a stone. This wasn't going to stop. Whatever this man wanted from me, he wasn't going to stop until he got it. I just had no idea what it was. I called in sick to work the next 2 days. Couldn't make myself leave the apartment. Couldn't face that parking lot or the walk home or any of the places where he might be waiting. My manager wasn't happy about it. We were short-staffed already and the holiday rush was coming. But I didn't care. Let them fire me. At least I'd be alive to find another job. I spent those 2 days mostly in my room, curtains drawn, checking my phone obsessively for news alerts about crimes in the area, anything that might explain who this man was or what he wanted. I found nothing, just the usual small-town stuff. Car break-ins, a DUI, someone's shed catching fire, nothing about a tall man who stalked teenagers and smiled at them in dark parking lots. On the 3rd day, Danny sat me down and told me I couldn't keep living like this. He said it gently, the way you'd talk to someone who was sick. But there was frustration underneath it too. He had a point, and I knew it. I couldn't hide in my room forever. I couldn't let this man, this stranger who'd never even spoken to me, take my whole life away. Trevor suggested we all go to work together that night, safety in numbers, and I'd ride with Danny and we'd carpool until this whole thing blew over. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something. It was better than cowering in the dark waiting for the other shoe to drop. So that night, around 3:45, all 3 of us piled into Danny's Civic and drove to my job. The plan was simple. Danny and Trevor would grab dinner at the fast food place across the street, kill some time at the bookstore in the strip mall, and then pick me up when my shift ended at midnight. I wouldn't be alone for more than a few minutes at any point. We'd mapped it all out, accounted for every gap, and as I walked into the grocery store and clocked in, I almost felt normal again. Almost felt like I had some control back. The shift itself was uneventful. Tuesday night, dead as always, just me and Marcus zoning aisles and making small talk about nothing important. I kept glancing at the windows, watching the parking lot through the big glass storefront, but I never saw anything unusual, just cars coming and going, customers shuffling in for late-night milk runs, the ordinary rhythms of retail life. By the time 11 o'clock rolled around, I'd almost convinced myself that the worst was over. Maybe he'd seen my friends, realized I wasn't an easy target anymore, decided to move on to someone more vulnerable. Maybe this was finally the end of it. At 11:47, the power went out. It happened all at once. The lights, the refrigerator hums, the soft background music, everything just cutting to black like someone had flipped a switch. For a second, I stood frozen in the darkness, my heart hammering, telling myself it was just a blown fuse, just an electrical issue, nothing sinister. Then the emergency lights kicked on, those dim red bulbs that barely illuminated anything, and I heard Marcus swearing somewhere near the registers. I made my way toward the front of the store, stepping carefully around displays I could barely see, and found him standing by the main entrance with his phone flashlight on. He said it was probably the transformer on the corner, that it had blown before during storms. I nodded like that made sense, even though the sky outside was clear and there wasn't a cloud in sight. Through the glass doors, I could see the street lights were still on. The parking lot lights were still on. Whatever had killed our power hadn't affected anything else on the block. Marcus tried the automatic doors, and they didn't budge. No power meant no sensors. So he went to find the manual release while I stood there watching the parking lot, my skin prickling with that familiar feeling of being watched. That's when I saw him. He was walking across the parking lot toward the store, not hurrying, not trying to hide, just walking with that same patient stride I'd come to recognize over the past few weeks. The emergency lights inside cast everything in a dim red glow, but I could see him clearly through the glass, tall, dark-haired, that lean frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the parking lot lights behind him. He was maybe 50 feet away, then 40, then 30, and he was smiling again, That same long smile I'd seen the night he waited by Danny's car. The smile that didn't reach his eyes, that looked more like a mask than an expression. I backed away from the doors, my breath coming fast and shallow, and screamed for Marcus. He came running from the back, asking what was wrong, and I pointed at the glass just as the stranger reached it. He stopped on the other side of the doors, maybe 3 feet away from me, separated by nothing but a pane of glass that suddenly felt very, very thin. For a long moment he just stood there looking at me, his face lit from below by the parking lot lights, shadows pooling in the hollows of his cheeks. Then he raised one hand and pressed it flat against the glass, fingers splayed wide, the same gesture that had left the handprint on Danny's car, and he mouthed something, a single word. I couldn't hear it through the glass, but I could read his lips clearly enough. Soon. Marcus was yelling now, telling him to back off, threatening to call the cops, but the stranger didn't even glance at him. His eyes stayed locked on mine, that smile never wavering, and then he just turned and walked away. Casual, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. He crossed the parking lot, stepped into the shadows at the far edge where the lights didn't reach, and vanished. I don't remember much of what happened next. Marcus called the police while I sat on the floor behind the registers, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. Danny and Trevor showed up before the cops did, having seen the dark storefront from across the street and come running. The police took statements, checked the parking lot, found nothing. The power came back on 20 minutes later, and no one could explain why it had gone out in the first place. The transformer was fine. The breakers were fine. Everything was fine, except that a man had walked up to me in the dark, pressed his hand against the glass, and promised me that something was coming. Danny drove us home in silence. Trevor kept checking the mirrors, watching for headlights behind us, but the streets were empty. When we got to the apartment, we checked every window, every door, every closet and corner. Nothing. No one. Just the 3 of us in our small living room, the TV muted and the lights blazing, trying to figure out what the hell we were supposed to do now. Soon. That's what he'd said. Not a question, not a demand, a promise. He was going to do something soon, and there was nothing I could do to stop it except wait. I quit my job the next morning, called my manager before the sun was even up, and told her I was done, effective immediately. She tried to talk me out of it, said I was one of the best closers she had, offered me day shifts instead if nights were the problem. I thanked her and hung up without explaining. How could I explain? How could I tell her that a man had been stalking me for weeks, that he'd cut the power to her store and pressed his hand against the glass and promised me something terrible, and that the police couldn't do anything about it? She'd think I was crazy. Hell, maybe I was crazy. But crazy or not, I was never setting foot in that parking lot again. We moved out of the apartment 2 weeks later. Danny found a place across town, a bigger unit in a newer building with a security gate and cameras in the hallways, and we broke our lease early and ate the fee without complaining. It felt like running away, and I guess it was. Trevor made some comment about how we were letting this guy win, letting him control our lives, but even he didn't argue when it came time to pack up the boxes. We'd all seen the stranger standing under that oak tree, looking up at our windows. We'd all felt what it was like to be watched in our own home. Some things are worth running from. The first few weeks in the new apartment were tense. I barely left except when I had to, and even then I made sure Danny or Trevor came with me. I got a new job at a warehouse on the other side of town, day shifts only, the kind of work where I was surrounded by people and machinery and noise from clock in to clock out. It wasn't great money, and the work was mind-numbing, but I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere bright and loud and full of witnesses. Somewhere a man couldn't walk up to me in the dark and whisper promises through the glass. Weeks turned into months, and I didn't see him. Not at the new apartment, not at the warehouse, not at the grocery store where I did my shopping now. A different chain, on the opposite end of town from my old job. I started to relax, just a little. Started to believe that maybe moving had worked, that maybe he'd lost track of me or gotten bored or found someone else to fixate on. I even went out alone a few times, Short trips to the corner store or the laundromat, testing the waters. Nothing happened. The world felt almost normal again, or at least a version of normal I could learn to live with. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. I never stopped checking the shadows at the edge of parking lots, scanning crowds for a tall figure standing too still, listening for footsteps that moved a little too slowly. The fear had burrowed into me somewhere deep, had rewired something in my brain that I don't think will ever fully heal. Even now, almost 2 years later, I can't walk past a dark window without flinching. I can't hear footsteps behind me on an empty street without my heart rate spiking. I sleep with my curtains closed and my door locked and a baseball bat under my bed. And some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I heard someone outside. The police never found him. I checked in a few times during those first months, called the detective who'd taken my report and asked if there were any updates, any leads, any explanation for who this man was or why he'd chosen me. The answer was always the same. They were looking into it. They'd let me know if anything came up. Nothing ever did. Derek Lewis, or whatever he was calling himself, had vanished as completely as he'd appeared, leaving behind nothing but a handful of police reports and a handprint on a car window that had long since been wiped clean. I still don't know what he wanted. That's the part that haunts me most. Even more than the sightings. Even more than that night at the store when he pressed his hand against the glass and smiled. I don't know if he was building up to something specific. An assault, a kidnapping, something worse. Or if the watching itself was the point. If he fed on fear the way other people feed on food and water. I don't know if he'd done this before, to other people in other towns, or if I was somehow special to him. I don't know if soon ever came, or if my running threw off whatever timeline he'd had in mind. The not knowing eats at me sometimes, late at night when the rain is coming down and the world feels small and dark. I run through scenarios in my head, trying to figure out what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd kept working those closing shifts, if I'd been alone on the wrong night at the wrong time. I never come up with good answers. Danny and Trevor still live in that apartment across town. I moved out about 8 months ago, got my own place in a different city, finally felt ready to try being alone again. We still talk, still get together for beers when I'm in town, but we don't really discuss that period of our lives. It's like this unspoken agreement we have. That chapter is closed, even if it never got a proper ending. Sometimes I catch Danny glancing at windows when we're out at night, or I notice Trevor checking behind us when we walk to his car. They carry it too, in their own ways. We all do. I'm telling this story because I think people need to know that these things happen. That there are men out there who watch and wait and choose their targets for reasons we'll never understand. That the police can't always help. That moving and hiding and changing your routines sometimes isn't enough. That the feeling of being hunted is something that stays with you long after the hunter disappears. I got lucky. I really believe that. Whatever he was planning, whatever soon meant, I got out before it happened. Not everyone does. So if you're reading this and something feels off, if there's someone in your life who appears where they shouldn't be, who watches a little too long, who makes your instincts scream even when they haven't technically done anything wrong, trust that feeling. Don't wait for it to escalate. Don't let anyone tell you you're being paranoid. Because paranoia is just another word for paying attention, and sometimes paying attention is the only thing that keeps you alive. I still think about him sometimes, when the nights get long and quiet. I wonder where he is, what he's doing, whose windows he's standing outside now. I wonder if he ever thinks about me, the one who got away, the teenager who ran before he could finish whatever game he was playing. And sometimes when the rain is falling and the streetlights cast long shadows across my bedroom wall, I wonder if he's still waiting, patient as ever, ready to pick up where he left off. I hope I never find out. Story 4, The Warehouse Footsteps Above the Ceiling. The thing about working overnights is that your brain starts to play tricks on you around 3 a.m. That's what I told myself the first time I heard it. just my mind filling the silence with sounds that weren't really there, manufacturing phantom noises to keep itself entertained during the long dead hours between midnight and dawn. I'd been working at Grayson Distribution for about 6 months by then, pulling the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. inventory shift, and I thought I knew all the building's quirks. The way the loading dock doors rattled when trucks passed on the highway a quarter mile away, the groaning of the old heating system when it kicked on, the skittering of mice in the walls that maintenance swore they'd take care of and never did. I'd made peace with all of it, learned to tune it out the way you tune out traffic noise when you live near a busy street. But the footsteps were different. The warehouse itself was a relic, built in the 1970s as some kind of manufacturing plant, converted to distribution about 15 years ago when the original company went under. It was all concrete floors and metal shelving units that stretched up toward a ceiling of acoustic tiles suspended on a grid of aluminum frames. Above those tiles was maybe 4 feet of empty space before you hit the actual roof. Just a gap full of ductwork and electrical conduits and insulation that had probably been pink once but had aged to a dirty yellow-gray. I knew this because I'd pushed up one of the ceiling tiles once, out of curiosity, and shined my flashlight into that space. Nothing up there but dust and pipes and the occasional dead bird that had gotten in through a vent somewhere and couldn't find its way out. No floor, no walkway, nothing that could support a person's weight. Just the metal grid holding up the tiles and a lot of empty air. I was 27 that year, 3 years out of a college degree I wasn't using, working nights because it paid $1.50 more than days and I needed every cent I could get. Student loans, car payment, rent on an apartment that was too expensive for what it was. The usual millennial sob story. The overnight shift wasn't so bad once you adjusted to sleeping during the day. Quiet, mostly. Just me and Reggie doing inventory counts, updating spreadsheets, making sure the numbers on the shelves matched the numbers in the system. Reggie was maybe 55, a lifer who'd been with the company since before the conversion, and he had this way of disappearing for hours at a time to check the back section that I'm pretty sure meant napping in one of the empty storage rooms. I didn't blame him. The nights were long, and there was only so much counting you could do before your eyes started to cross. It was a Thursday night, technically Friday morning, I guess, somewhere around 2:30 a.m. when I first heard it. I was in aisle 14, scanning barcodes on a shipment of industrial cleaning supplies that had come in the day before when something moved above me. Not the skittering of mice, not the settling of old building materials. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the ceiling directly overhead, moving from one end of the aisle toward the other. I stopped scanning and looked up, watching the ceiling tiles like I expected to see them bowing under someone's weight. The sound continued for maybe 5 or 6 steps, then stopped. Just stopped, right above where I was standing, like whoever was up there had paused to look down at me through the thin barrier of acoustic tile. I stood there for a long moment, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to continue. It didn't. The warehouse was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of a truck on the highway. I told myself it was nothing. Pipes expanding, ductwork shifting, some mundane explanation that would seem obvious in the light of day. But my heart was beating faster than it should have been, and when I went back to scanning barcodes, I kept glancing up at the ceiling like I expected something to come through it. I found Reggie in the break room about an hour later, eating a sandwich and watching something on his phone. I asked him, trying to keep my voice casual, if he'd ever heard anything weird in the building. Noises from the ceiling, footsteps, anything like that. He gave me this look, half amused and half pitying, and told me the building was old as dirt and made all kinds of sounds. You work nights long enough, you start hearing things, he said. Just your brain getting bored. Don't let it spook you. I nodded like that made sense, like I believed him, and went back to my section to finish the count. But I didn't stop thinking about it, and 2 nights later, when I heard the footsteps again, same aisle, same slow, deliberate pace, same sudden stop directly above my head, I knew it wasn't just my brain getting bored. Something was up there, something that moved like a person, that stopped when I stopped, that seemed to know exactly where I was standing. I just had no idea what it was, or why it only came out in those dead hours when the rest of the world was asleep and the warehouse felt like the loneliest place on earth. I started paying closer attention after that, documenting the incidents in the Notes app on my phone like some kind of amateur paranormal investigator. Date, time, location, duration. I logged everything, hoping to find a pattern that would explain what I was hearing. Maybe it was connected to the heating system cycling on, or trucks rumbling past on the highway, or some mechanical process I didn't understand. There had to be a rational explanation. There always was, right? Buildings made noises. Old buildings made more noises than most. I just needed to figure out what specifically was causing these particular sounds, and then I could go back to my normal routine of counting boxes and trying not to fall asleep on my feet. The pattern I found wasn't the one I was looking for. The footsteps happened most often between 2 and 4 a.m., during that stretch of the night when the world outside felt farthest away and the silence inside the warehouse seemed to press against my eardrums. They happened when I was alone in an aisle, never when Reggie was nearby or when I was in the break room or the front office. And they happened most frequently in the older section of the warehouse, the back third of the building that still had the original ceiling tiles from the 70s, yellowed, water-stained in places, sagging slightly in their frames like they might give way at any moment. I started avoiding that section when I could, finding reasons to count inventory in the newer part of the building, but sometimes the job required me to go back there, and every time I did, I heard them. The thing that really started to get to me was the responsiveness. It wasn't just random footsteps echoing through empty space. It was footsteps that reacted to my presence. If I walked, they walked. If I stopped, they stopped. If I stood perfectly still and held my breath, the silence above me would stretch out for 30 seconds, a minute, longer, until I moved again and the footsteps resumed. It was like something up there was tracking me, matching my movements step for step, waiting to see what I would do next. I tested it one night, deliberately varying my pace, fast, then slow, then stopped completely, and whatever was above me followed along like a shadow. That was the night I stopped being able to convince myself it was pipes or ductwork or my imagination. Pipes don't listen, pipes don't follow. I brought a flashlight to work after that, one of those heavy-duty mag lights that could double as a weapon if I needed it to. During my breaks, when Reggie was off doing whatever Reggie did in the storage rooms, I'd push up the ceiling tiles and shine the beam into the space above. Dust, ductwork, insulation. The same things I'd seen before. The same empty gap between the suspended ceiling and the roof. No footprints in the dust. No signs that anything had been moving around up there. The metal grid that held the tiles looked undisturbed, and I could see pretty clearly that there was no way a person could walk up there without falling through. The tiles were thin, the grid was flimsy, and even if someone was somehow light enough to navigate it, they would have left marks. There was nothing. Just empty space and the faint, musty smell of a building that had been accumulating dust for decades. But the footsteps kept coming. I tried talking to Reggie about it again, more seriously this time. Told him exactly what I was hearing, when I was hearing it, how the sounds seemed to follow my movements. He listened with that same half-amused expression, then asked if I'd been getting enough sleep. "Night shift messes with your head," he said. "I've been doing this 20 years, kid. The building talks sometimes. You just gotta learn not to listen." He wasn't being dismissive exactly, more like he genuinely believed that what I was experiencing was a normal part of working overnights in an old warehouse. And maybe for him it was. Maybe he'd heard the footsteps too, years ago, and had made peace with them the way you make peace with any unexplainable thing, by deciding not to think about it, by filing it away in the part of your brain reserved for mysteries you'll never solve. I couldn't do that. The sounds were too clear, too deliberate, too responsive to my presence to write off as ambient noise. Something was happening, even if I couldn't explain it, and the not knowing was starting to eat at me in ways that bled into my life outside the warehouse. I wasn't sleeping well during the day, kept waking up from dreams where I was lying in bed and hearing footsteps on the ceiling above me. I started checking the ceiling of my apartment, actually looking up and listening for sounds that weren't there, and felt ridiculous every time I did it, but couldn't stop myself. The paranoia was spreading, colonizing parts of my brain that used to feel safe. About 3 weeks after the first incident, I decided to do some research on the building. Figured if something weird was happening, maybe there was history that would explain it. A death during construction, an accident in the manufacturing days, something that would give shape to the formless dread I was carrying around. I went to the public library on my day off, dug through old newspaper archives, found a few articles about Grayson Manufacturing from before it became Grayson Distribution. Most of it was boring corporate stuff, expansions and layoffs and quarterly earnings. But one article from 1987 made me stop cold. A maintenance worker had died in the building. Guy named Harold Finch, 52 years old, found by the morning crew after he'd been working alone overnight. The article didn't say exactly how he died, just that it was an apparent accident and that the company was cooperating with investigators. But there was one detail that stuck with me, that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Harold Finch had been found in the ceiling. Not under it, not near it, in it. Somehow, for reasons the article didn't explain, he'd been up in that 4-foot gap between the tiles and the roof when he died, and his body had been suspended there among the ductwork until someone noticed the smell. I read that paragraph 3 times, trying to make it make sense. Why would a maintenance worker be crawling around in the ceiling space? How had he died up there? And why hadn't anyone noticed he was missing until the smell gave him away? The article didn't answer any of these questions, and the follow-up coverage was minimal, just a brief mention that the investigation had concluded with no finding of foul play. Case closed. Harold Finch was dead, and whatever had happened to him in that ceiling was officially nobody's business. I drove home from the library feeling like something had shifted in my chest, like a gear had clicked into place, and suddenly everything was spinning faster than before. I didn't know what I'd found exactly, or what it meant for the sounds I was hearing every night. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones and wouldn't leave, that I wasn't alone in that warehouse. And whatever was up there with me, it had been there for a very, very long time. I almost didn't go to work that night. Sat in my apartment for 2 hours before my shift, staring at the wall and running through scenarios in my head. I could call in sick, buy myself a day to figure out what to do next. I could quit entirely, find another job, let someone else deal with whatever was haunting that building. But quitting meant giving up a paycheck I desperately needed, and calling in sick just delayed the inevitable. Sooner or later, I'd have to go back. Sooner or later, I'd have to face whatever was waiting for me in that ceiling. So I put on my work clothes, grabbed my flashlight, and drove to Grayson Distribution, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps started earlier that night. Usually I didn't hear them until after 2 a.m., but that shift they began around 11:30 before Reggie had even finished his first coffee. I was in aisle 9, nowhere near the old section, scanning a pallet of paper products that had come in that afternoon. The sound came from directly overhead, not the slow, deliberate pace I'd grown accustomed to, but something faster, more agitated, like someone pacing back and forth in a confined space. I froze with the scanner in my hand, watching the ceiling tiles above me, and the footsteps stopped. Then started again, then stopped. The rhythm was wrong, erratic in a way that made my skin crawl. Whatever was up there, it felt different tonight. Angrier, maybe, or excited. I found Reggie in the break room and asked him, point blank, if he'd ever heard of Harold Finch. The way his face changed told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. The color drained out of his cheeks, and he set down his coffee cup with a careful deliberateness that suggested he was buying time to think. For a long moment, he just looked at me, his expression cycling through something complicated. Surprise, maybe, or fear, or the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret for too long. Then he asked me how I'd found out about that, and I told him about the library, the newspaper article, the maintenance worker who died in the ceiling almost 40 years ago. Reggie listened without interrupting, nodding slowly like I was confirming something he'd suspected all along. When I finished, he told me the part the newspaper hadn't printed. Harold Finch hadn't just died in the ceiling. He'd been living up there. For weeks, maybe longer, nobody knew exactly how long. He'd been fired months earlier for drinking on the job, but instead of leaving, he'd found a way into the space above the tiles and made himself a little nest up there. Brought in blankets, food, water bottles. Watched the workers below through gaps in the ceiling tiles, moving around at night when the building was empty, coming down occasionally to steal supplies from the warehouse. Nobody knew he was there until the smell got bad enough that someone finally went looking. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but Reggie said there were rumors. Rumors that Harold had been up there so long he'd gone crazy, that he'd started believing the warehouse belonged to him, that he'd been planning something before his heart gave out. They found a journal, Reggie said, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper, filled with names of workers, schedules, notes about who came and went. Nobody knows what he was planning to do with all that information, but it wasn't anything good. I asked Reggie why he hadn't told me this before, when I'd first asked about the noises. He shrugged, looking older than I'd ever seen him look, and said he'd hoped I wouldn't need to know. Said the footsteps came and went, that some people heard them and some didn't, and that most folks who worked the night shift just learned to ignore them and get on with their lives. I've been here 20 years, he said. Heard him walking around up there more times than I can count. Never did anything but walk. Figured as long as I left him alone, he'd leave me alone. I wanted to ask how he could be so calm about it, how he could come to work every night knowing something dead was pacing the ceiling above his head, but I didn't get the chance. Because that's when the lights in the break room flickered, and we both heard it. Footsteps, directly overhead, moving fast and getting louder. Reggie's face went white. In all the years he'd worked here, he told me later, the footsteps had never come to the break room. They stayed in the warehouse proper, in the aisles and the back section and the old part of the building. They didn't follow people into the offices or the break areas. That was the unspoken rule, the boundary that had never been crossed. But now something was running across the ceiling above us, the tiles actually shaking in their frames, dust sifting down like dirty snow. We sat there frozen, watching the ceiling buckle and sway with each impact, and then one of the tiles in the far corner cracked straight down the middle with a sound like a gunshot. I was on my feet before I knew I was moving, backing toward the door with my flashlight raised like it could protect me from whatever was about to come through. Reggie hadn't moved, was still sitting in his chair, staring up at the cracked tile with an expression I couldn't read. Fear, yes, but something else too. Resignation, maybe. Acceptance. Like he'd always known this moment would come and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel something up there, hovering just above the damaged tile, waiting. The silence was worse than the sound had been. The silence felt like anticipation. I told Reggie we needed to leave, needed to get out of the building right now and call someone. The police, the fire department, anyone. He shook his head slowly without looking away from the ceiling. Won't do any good, he said. He's been here longer than any of us. Building belongs to him now. I didn't know what that meant, didn't want to know. But before I could argue, the cracked tile shifted. Just a little, just enough to create a gap, maybe 2 inches wide along the fracture line. And through that gap, in the darkness of the space above, I saw something pale move. Something that might have been a hand. Something that was reaching down toward us, fingers spread wide, feeling for the edge of the tile like it was testing whether it could push through. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. Left Reggie sitting in that break room and sprinted for the front entrance, my footsteps echoing through the empty warehouse, and behind me, above me, I could hear it following. Running when I ran, matching my pace step for step, that same responsiveness I'd noticed before, but faster now, more urgent. I hit the front doors and burst out into the parking lot, the cold night air hitting my lungs like a slap. and I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I sat there in the driver's seat with the doors locked, shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition, watching the warehouse for any sign that something had followed me out. Nothing came through the doors. The building just sat there, dark and silent, looking exactly the way it always had. But I knew what was inside now. I knew what had been watching me, following me, waiting for something I couldn't understand. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was never going back in there again. I sat in my car for almost an hour, trying to work up the courage to do something. Call the police, call my manager, go back inside and find Reggie. Something, anything, other than sitting in a dark parking lot shaking like a child who'd seen a monster under the bed. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that what I'd seen couldn't have been real. That ceiling tiles don't crack on their own, and dead men don't reach down from the darkness with pale grasping hands. But the rest of me, the part that had spent weeks listening to footsteps that followed my every move, knew better. Something was in that building. Something that had been dormant or patient or content with just watching until tonight, when it decided that watching wasn't enough anymore. I finally called Reggie's cell phone, my fingers clumsy on the screen. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. I told myself he was probably fine, that he'd gotten out through the back entrance or was holed up in one of the offices waiting for me to come back. But I couldn't make myself believe it. The image of him sitting in that break room chair, staring up at the cracked tile with that look of resignation on his face, kept playing in my head on a loop. He'd known something was coming. He'd accepted it in a way I couldn't understand. And when I'd run, I'd left him alone with whatever had been reaching down through the ceiling. Around 4 a.m., I finally drove to the police station and tried to explain what had happened. The officer at the front desk listened with the kind of patient, slightly condescending expression that told me he'd heard plenty of crazy stories from night shift workers before. I told him there might be someone trapped in the building, that my co-worker wasn't answering his phone, that something had happened in the break room that I couldn't fully explain. He asked if I'd been drinking, if I was on any medications, if I'd had any mental health issues in the past. I said no to all of it, and watched his skepticism deepen with every answer. Eventually, he agreed to send a car to do a welfare check, more to get rid of me than out of any genuine concern, and I followed them back to the warehouse in my own vehicle, keeping my distance like the building might reach out and grab me if I got too close. The officers went inside while I waited in the parking lot, my engine running and my doors locked. They were in there for maybe 20 minutes, long enough for the sky to start lightening on the eastern horizon, and when they came back out they looked bored rather than alarmed. The building was empty, they said. No sign of anyone, no sign of any disturbance. The break room was intact, no cracked ceiling tiles, no damage of any kind. They'd checked every aisle, every office, every storage room. Nobody was there. When I asked about the ceiling, asked if they'd looked up into the space above the tiles, they exchanged a glance that told me they thought I was losing my mind. One of them said they'd shined a flashlight up there, hadn't seen anything unusual, just dust and ductwork, just empty space. I drove home as the sun came up, my head pounding and my thoughts scattered into fragments I couldn't piece together. Reggie wasn't in the building. The ceiling tile I'd watched crack in half was somehow intact. Either I'd hallucinated the entire thing, or something had cleaned up after itself, put everything back the way it was supposed to be, erased the evidence of what had happened. I didn't know which possibility was worse. I called Reggie's phone again from my apartment, and this time it didn't even ring, just went straight to a message saying the number was no longer in service. I tried the warehouse's main line next, got the daytime manager, and asked if Reggie had clocked out at the end of his shift. There was a long pause on the other end, and then the manager asked who I was talking about. I said Reggie from the night shift, the guy I'd been working with for the past 6 months. Another pause, longer this time. "We don't have anyone named Reggie on the overnight crew," she said. "It's just you and Marcus. Has been for over a year now." I hung up without saying goodbye and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to make sense of words that didn't fit together in any logical order. No Reggie. No record of him. Like he'd never existed. Like I'd invented him wholesale out of sleep deprivation and isolation and the particular madness that comes from spending too many hours in a building that breathes and watches and waits. But I remembered him so clearly, his coffee-stained mug, his half-amused smile when I asked about the noises, the way he'd said, "The building belongs to him now," with that look of weary acceptance on his face. He'd been real. I knew he'd been real. Except now there was no evidence he'd ever existed at all, and I was the only one who remembered him. I didn't go back to work. Couldn't even consider it. Not after everything that had happened, not with Reggie's disappearance, or erasure, or whatever it was, hanging over me like a fog I couldn't see through. I called the manager and quit over the phone, gave some excuse about a family emergency, said I'd come pick up my last check whenever it was ready. She sounded annoyed but not surprised. Overnight workers quit all the time, burned out by the hours and the isolation and the particular strain of existing on the margins of the normal world. I didn't tell her the real reason. Didn't tell anyone the real reason, because how could I? I'd spent 6 months working alongside a man who apparently didn't exist, in a building haunted by another man who'd died in the ceiling 40 years ago. And the one night I'd tried to run from it, reality itself had bent to cover the tracks. I spent the next few days in a haze, barely sleeping, barely eating, jumping at every creak and groan my apartment made as it settled in the night. I kept thinking about Harold Finch, the journal full of names, the notes about workers' schedules, the rumors that he'd been planning something before his heart gave out. I thought about Reggie's resignation, the way he'd said the footsteps had never come to the break room before, the unspoken rules that had apparently kept people safe for decades. And I thought about what had changed, what had made that night different from all the others. The only answer I could come up with was me. I'd gone digging. I'd found the story. I'd learned Harold's name and history, and somehow, in doing so, I'd woken something that had been content to pace the ceiling and watch. I'd made it hungry for more. The warehouse is still there. I drive past it sometimes, on my way to other places, and I always slow down just a little to look at the building. It looks the same as it always did. Squat, gray, unremarkable, the kind of place you'd pass 1,000 times without noticing. But I notice. I notice the windows that seem darker than they should be, even in full daylight. I notice the way the parking lot is always empty now, even during business hours. I notice that the now hiring sign has been in the window for 8 months straight, and I wonder how many people have applied, how many have started the overnight shift, how many have heard footsteps above them in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. It's been almost 3 years since I quit Grayson Distribution, and I still haven't fully made sense of what happened to me in that building. The easy explanation is that I had some kind of breakdown, that the isolation of night shifts combined with sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination created a perfect storm of paranoid delusion. That's what a therapist would probably say if I ever worked up the courage to see one. Reggie was a figment. The footsteps were auditory hallucinations. The hand reaching through the ceiling was a stress-induced psychotic episode. Case closed. Take these pills. Get some rest. Try not to work overnights anymore. It's a neat, tidy explanation that fits comfortably within the bounds of normal human experience. But I don't believe it. I can't believe it, no matter how hard I try, because I remember Reggie too clearly for him to have been a product of my imagination. The specific cadence of his voice, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands like he was trying to absorb its warmth, the smell of the cigarettes he smoked on his breaks, even though smoking wasn't allowed on company property. These aren't the vague impressions of a hallucination. They're the concrete, sensory details of a real person, someone I worked alongside night after night for half a year. He existed. I know he existed. And whatever happened to him that night in the break room, whatever process erased him from the company's records and the memories of everyone except me, it wasn't natural. It wasn't something that can be explained away with terms like dissociative episode or false memory syndrome. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what Reggie might have been if he wasn't simply a co-worker who disappeared. The most unsettling theory I've come up with is that he was like Harold Finch, not a ghost exactly, but an echo. Someone who'd worked in that building maybe decades ago and never really left. Someone who'd been absorbed into the place the same way Harold had been absorbed, becoming part of its ecosystem, walking the aisles and drinking coffee in the break room and warning new workers about the sounds they might hear. Maybe that's why he knew so much about Harold's history, why he'd seemed so resigned when the ceiling started to crack, why he'd told me the building belonged to him, with a certainty that suggested personal experience. Maybe Reggie had been through this before, had watched other workers come and go, had played out this same scenario a dozen times with a dozen different people. And maybe, when I ran and left him behind, the building simply reclaimed him, pulled him back into whatever liminal space it keeps its permanent residence, reset him for the next new hire who needed to be eased into the truth. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the desperate rationalization of someone who can't accept that his mind betrayed him. But I've looked into the history of that building more since I left, digging through records and archives and old employee forums where people share stories they'd never tell their bosses. And I'm not the only one who's experienced strange things at Grayson Distribution. There are posts going back years, decades even, from overnight workers who heard footsteps in the ceiling, who felt watched in the empty aisles, who quit suddenly and refused to explain why. A few of them mention a co-worker who helped them adjust to the night shift, an older guy who seemed to know the building's secrets, who warned them about certain sections and certain hours. The names are different. Sometimes it's Reggie, sometimes it's Frank, sometimes it's a guy called Old Mike, but the descriptions are always the same. Patient, world-weary, slightly amused by the newcomer's fear, like he'd seen it all before and would see it all again. I found one post buried deep in a thread from 2011 that stopped me cold. A former employee describing his last night at the warehouse, how the ceiling tiles had started shaking during his break, how his co-worker, a long-timer named Ray, had just sat there watching like he was waiting for something, how the poster had run for the exit and never looked back, and how, when he'd tried to find Ray afterward, no one at the company had any record of him ever working there. The story was almost identical to mine, detail for detail, except it had happened 12 years before I set foot in that building. I read it 3 times, feeling something cold settle into the pit of my stomach, and then I closed my laptop and didn't open it again for a week. The warehouse is still operating, as far as I know. Different company name now. They rebranded about a year after I left, became part of some larger distribution network. But the building is the same. I looked it up on Google Maps once, zoomed in on the satellite view like I might see something hidden in the rooftop, some shadow or stain that would confirm what I already knew. There was nothing there, of course. Just a gray rectangle surrounded by parking lot, indistinguishable from 1,000 other warehouses and 1,000 other industrial parks. Whatever lives inside that building, it doesn't show up on satellite imagery. It doesn't leave evidence. It just waits, patient as stone, for the next person who needs a job badly enough to work the overnight shift. I have a different job now, something in an office with normal hours and plenty of co-workers and ceilings made of solid drywall instead of flimsy acoustic tiles. I sleep at night like a regular person, go to work in the morning, come home in the evening. My life has a rhythm to it that feels safe, predictable, grounded in the ordinary world. But I still check ceilings sometimes, in buildings I've never been to before. Still listen for footsteps in spaces where no one should be walking. Still feel that prickle at the back of my neck when I'm alone in a room and the silence gets too heavy, too expectant, like something is waiting for me to notice it. The fear never really goes away. It just finds new places to hide, new moments to surface, new ceilings to watch. I think about Harold Finch more than I should. about what it must have been like for him, hiding up there in the dark, watching the workers below through gaps in the tiles, slowly losing whatever grip he had on sanity or humanity. I think about how long he was up there before his heart gave out, how many nights he spent pacing that narrow space between the ceiling and the roof, how completely he must have come to believe that the building was his. And I think about what happens to a person, or what's left of a person, when they die in a place like that. Whether the building absorbs them, uses them, turns them into something that isn't quite alive, but isn't quite gone either. Whether Harold is still up there, still walking, still watching. Whether Reggie is with him now, another echo in an endless loop, waiting to welcome the next new hire. I don't have answers. I probably never will. All I have is a memory of footsteps that followed me through empty aisles, a cracked ceiling tile that healed itself overnight, and a coworker who vanished so completely that the world forgot he'd ever existed. All I have is the knowledge that there are places in this world where the rules don't apply, where the dead don't stay dead and the walls have appetites, where working the night shift can cost you more than just your sleep. The warehouse taught me that. Reggie taught me that. And Harold Finch, pacing endlessly in the space above the ceiling, is still teaching that lesson to anyone unlucky enough to listen. If you ever find yourself working overnights in a building that feels too quiet, too watchful, too aware of your presence, get out. Don't wait for evidence. Don't try to rationalize the sounds you hear or the shadows you see moving in your peripheral vision. Just leave and don't look back, and count yourself lucky if the building lets you go. Because some places don't let go. Some places keep what they catch, fold it into themselves, use it to lure the next victim through the door. I got out. I think I got out anyway. But sometimes, late at night when the rain is falling and my apartment is too quiet, I hear something above my ceiling. A soft sound, barely there. Like footsteps, like someone pacing. Like something that followed me home and is waiting, patient as ever, for me to finally look up. Story 5, The Shadow That Moved Behind My TV. I've always been the kind of person who needs background noise. Silence makes me anxious, not in a dramatic way, just this low-level hum of discomfort that settles in when things get too quiet. Growing up, I fell asleep to the television every night. My mom hated it, said I was wasting electricity, but she eventually gave up trying to break the habit. Even now, at 24, I keep the TV on while I work, while I cook, while I scroll mindlessly through my phone before bed. It's not about what's playing. It's about having something there, filling the space, keeping the silence from pressing in. That's probably why I noticed so quickly when something started moving behind it. I'd moved into the basement apartment about 3 months before any of this started. It was cheap, suspiciously cheap, honestly, but I was drowning in credit card debt and couldn't afford to ask too many questions. The landlord was this older guy named Mr. Brennan who lived upstairs, and he seemed decent enough. Kept to himself, didn't bother me about noise, fixed the leaky faucet within a day of me reporting it. The apartment itself was small but functional, a main room that served as living room and bedroom, a tiny kitchen with appliances from the 80s, a bathroom with a shower head that took 10 minutes to produce hot water. The ceilings were low. The windows were those narrow basement rectangles that sat at ground level and let in more shadows than light, and the walls had a faint dampness to them that never quite went away no matter how high I cranked the heat. But it was mine. First place I'd ever lived completely alone, and I was determined to make it work. I set up my TV against the far wall, opposite the couch that doubled as my bed. It was a decent-sized flat screen I'd bought secondhand, mounted on a cheap stand that left maybe 8 inches of gap between the back of the TV and the wall. I didn't think anything of that gap at first. It was just dead space, a place where dust bunnies accumulated and charging cables disappeared. I pushed the stand as close to the wall as it would go and forgot about it. The first time I saw the shadow, I was half asleep. It was maybe 2 in the morning, and I dozed off watching some true crime documentary, the kind with moody lighting and ominous music that's somehow still boring enough to sleep through. I woke up to the narrator droning on about blood spatter patterns, my neck stiff from the weird angle I'd been lying at. The room was dark except for the TV's glow, and as I reached for the remote to turn it off, I saw something move, just a flicker, a darkness shifting behind the screen, visible through the gap between the TV and the wall. I froze with my hand outstretched, staring at that narrow space, waiting to see it again. Nothing happened. The TV kept playing, the narrator kept talking, and the gap behind the screen was just a gap, empty, still, unremarkable. I told myself I'd imagined it, a trick of the light, maybe, or the movement of shadows from the screen reflecting off the wall. I turned off the TV, pulled my blanket up to my chin, and went back to sleep, but I didn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few days, I found myself watching that gap more than I watched whatever was actually on the screen. I'd be working on my laptop, some home renovation show playing in the background, and my eyes would drift to the space behind the TV, looking for movement, looking for proof that I hadn't imagined it. Part of me felt ridiculous. I was a grown woman staring at an empty gap like a kid checking under the bed for monsters. But another part, the part that still remembered the flicker of darkness I'd seen, couldn't let it go. The second time happened about a week later. Same situation, late night, half asleep, TV casting blue light across the room. This time I wasn't dozing. I was lying on my side, facing the screen, watching some cooking competition I didn't care about. And I saw it clearly. A shadow, separate from the shadows the TV was casting, sliding slowly across the gap from left to right. It moved with purpose, like something passing behind the screen, and it was there long enough that I couldn't dismiss it as a trick of my tired eyes. I sat up so fast I got dizzy, grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the gap behind the TV. Nothing, just wall, just dust, just the tangle of power cords and HDMI cables I'd never bothered to organize. I got up and walked over, shining the light directly into the space, my heart hammering in a way that felt out of proportion to the situation. There was nowhere for anything to hide. The gap was 8 inches deep at most, and the wall behind it was solid. I knocked on it to be sure, felt the firm resistance of concrete beneath the drywall. Nothing could have been back there. Nothing could have moved the way I'd seen it move. I stood there for a long time, flashlight beam trembling slightly in my grip, trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. That seemed easier to accept somehow than the alternative. Shadows don't move on their own. They don't slide purposefully across walls, independent of any light source. They don't exist without something to cast them. But I'd seen it. Twice now, I'd seen it. I slept with the lights on that night, the TV dark and silent for the first time since I'd moved in. The quiet pressed against my ears like cotton, and every creak of the old building made me flinch. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of something standing in the corner of my room, just outside the reach of the lamp's glow, waiting for me to turn my head. I tried to rationalize it over the next few days, talked myself through every possible explanation while I made coffee, while I commuted to work, while I sat at my desk pretending to focus on spreadsheets. Light refraction, maybe, the TV producing weird optical effects I didn't understand, a mouse or rat running along the baseboard behind the stand, my own reflection catching in the screen at just the right angle to create the illusion of movement. I ran through the possibilities like a checklist, trying to find one that felt true enough to believe. None of them did. The thing is, I knew what I'd seen. Not a flicker, not a blur, not something my peripheral vision had invented and my brain had filled in. I'd watched that shadow slide across the gap, slow and deliberate, like something walking behind a curtain. It had weight to it, presence, and no amount of rational explanation could change the fact that when I closed my eyes, I could still see it moving. I mentioned it to my friend Caitlin over lunch that week, keeping my tone light like it was a funny anecdote rather than something that had kept me up 2 nights in a row. "So get this," I said. "I think my apartment might be haunted." She laughed the way you're supposed to laugh when your friend says something absurd, and I laughed too, and we moved on to talking about her terrible Hinge dates. But she texted me later that night, asking if I was serious, and I didn't know how to answer. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally sending a shrug emoji and changing the subject. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, that I was scared. Genuinely, deeply scared in a way I hadn't been since I was a kid afraid of the dark. It felt stupid to admit, even to myself. I was a functioning adult with a job and bills and a modest 401k. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in anything that couldn't be measured, quantified, explained by science. And yet every night when the sun went down and my basement apartment sank into shadow, I felt my chest tighten with a dread I couldn't name. The 3rd time I saw it, I was ready. I'd set up my phone on the coffee table, propped against a stack of books, camera pointed at the TV. The plan was to record all night and review the footage in the morning. Either I'd catch something on video and prove I wasn't crazy, or I'd see nothing and be able to finally let it go. I pressed record around 11 p.m., turned on a random Netflix show for background noise, and settled onto the couch with a book I pretended to read. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. I was starting to doze off, the book slipping from my fingers when I saw it. Not behind the TV this time, beside it. A shadow darker than the darkness around it, standing in the corner where the TV stand met the wall. It wasn't moving. Just standing there, utterly still, shaped like a person but without features, without edges, like someone had cut a hole in the air and left it there. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body had locked up the way it does in nightmares, every muscle frozen while my brain shrieked at me to run. The shadow stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and then it shifted, not toward me, toward the TV. It slid behind the screen, disappearing into that 8-inch gap. And as it moved, I heard something. A whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But it was there, threading through the dialogue from whatever show was playing, a voice that didn't belong to anyone on screen. I couldn't make out words. It was more like the shape of words, the rhythm of speech without the meaning. And then it was gone, and the shadow was gone. And I was sitting on my couch in the blue glow of the television, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I grabbed my phone with numb fingers and stopped the recording. The timestamp showed 3 hours and 47 minutes. I scrubbed through the footage right there, hands trembling, looking for the moment I'd seen the shadow appear in the corner. The video showed nothing. Just my empty living room, the TV playing, the corner where I'd seen the figure completely dark and still. No shadow, no movement, no shape standing there watching me while I lay frozen on the couch. I played it back 3 times, adjusting the brightness on my phone screen, looking for any sign that something had been there. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Sat on the couch with every light on, the TV off for once, watching the corners of my apartment like they might lunge at me if I looked away. When the sun finally came up and weak gray light started filtering through those narrow basement windows, I felt my body unclench for the first time in hours. Daylight meant safety. Daylight meant I could pretend everything was normal, could go to work and drink coffee and have conversations about nothing, could file away what I'd seen in the part of my brain reserved for things I didn't want to examine too closely. But I knew, even then, that I couldn't keep doing this. The shadow wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting bolder, moving from behind the TV to the corner of the room, making sounds instead of just sliding silently through the dark. Whatever it was escalating, and I had no idea what came next. I started researching the apartment, figured if something was haunting this place, there had to be a history, a death, a tragedy, something that would explain why a shadow was crawling out of my walls at 2 a.m. I spent my lunch breaks at work Googling the address, searching county records, scrolling through old news archives. The building had been constructed in 1962, originally a single-family home, before someone converted the basement into a rental unit in the 90s. I found nothing unusual. No murders, no suicides, no mysterious disappearances. Just a boring old house that had changed hands a few times over the decades. I even asked Mr. Brennan about it. Caught him one Saturday morning when he was checking the mail, tried to keep my voice casual. "Hey, weird question, but do you know if anything ever happened in the basement? Like, before I moved in?" He gave me a strange look. "Happened how?" "I don't know. Anything unusual. Deaths, maybe, or..." I trailed off, realizing how crazy I sounded. He shook his head slowly, his expression shifting into something I couldn't quite read. "Nobody's died down there, if that's what you're asking. Had a few tenants over the years. None of them stayed too long." He paused, then added, "You're not having problems, are you?" I told him no, everything was fine, just curious. But I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. None of them stayed too long. What did that mean? Did they leave because of normal reasons? Job transfers, relationship changes, the general restlessness of people in their 20s? Or did they leave because something in that basement apartment had driven them out? The shadow appeared again that night, and this time it didn't wait for me to be half asleep. I was washing dishes in the tiny kitchen, the TV playing some sitcom in the living room, when I glanced over and saw it, standing directly in front of the screen. Not behind it, not beside it. In front of it, blocking the light, casting its own darkness across my floor. It was taller than me, taller than any person I knew, and it was facing my direction. The plate slipped from my hands and shattered in the sink. I didn't look away. Couldn't look away. Some animal part of my brain convinced that if I broke eye contact, it would move, would cross the room in the time it took me to blink. We stayed like that for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30, me frozen at the sink with soap dripping down my wrists, and this thing standing in my living room like it owned the place. Then it spoke. Not a whisper this time, a voice, low and rasping, like someone talking through a throat full of gravel, and I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them. They crawled across my skin like insects, burrowed into my ears, made my vision blur at the edges. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside me. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls and the floor and the dark space behind my own eyes. And then it was gone. 1 second it was there, solid as shadow can be, and the next, the TV light was spilling across an empty floor, and I was alone in my apartment. The voice stopped. The crawling sensation faded. I stood at the sink for a long time, breathing in sharp little gasps, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. Not that night. I called in sick to work the next day. Couldn't face the commute, the fluorescent lights, the mundane conversations with coworkers about weekend plans and traffic. I sat on my couch wrapped in a blanket, curtains open to let in as much daylight as possible, and tried to figure out what to do. Moving out wasn't really an option. I'd signed a year lease and couldn't afford to break it, couldn't afford first and last month's rent on a new place while still paying for this one. I could try to find a subletter, but that felt wrong somehow. Like I'd be passing this thing along to someone else, making my problem theirs. I thought about telling someone, really telling them, not the half-joking way I'd mentioned it to Caitlin. But who would believe me? I barely believed myself, and I was the one living it. I'd seen the video footage. Hours of empty room, no shadow, no figure, nothing but static light from the TV. Whatever this thing was, it didn't want to be recorded. It didn't want evidence. It wanted to exist in the space between what I knew and what I could prove. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to church. Not for mass or confession or anything like that. I just walked in, sat in a pew near the back, and breathed. The space was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than my apartment. Peaceful rather than watchful. Empty rather than waiting. I sat there for maybe an hour, not praying exactly, but not doing nothing either. When I left, I grabbed a small bottle of holy water from the little stand by the entrance. I didn't know if I believed in it. I didn't know if I believed in anything anymore, but it felt like doing something, and I desperately needed to feel like I was doing something. That night, I sprinkled the holy water behind the TV, along the baseboards, across the threshold of the door, around the perimeter of the room. I felt stupid the whole time, like a kid playing pretend, but I did it anyway. Then I sat on the couch and waited, the bottle clutched in my hands, watching the shadows gather as the sun went down. The TV was off. I'd unplugged it that morning, coiled the power cord neatly, left the screen dark and dead. I told myself that whatever this thing was, it seemed connected to the television somehow, always appearing behind it, or beside it, or in front of it, like the screen was a doorway it was using to push through. Maybe cutting the power would cut it off. Maybe it was that simple. I should have known better. Around midnight, the TV turned on. I watched it happen, the screen flickering to life even though the cord was lying unplugged on the floor 3 feet away. Static crackling across the display, filling the room with gray-white light and that hissing sound that burrows into your skull. And in the static, I saw something. A shape, a figure, moving toward the screen from somewhere deep inside it, getting larger as it approached, getting closer. I couldn't move. The static filled my ears, my head, drowned out everything except the hiss and crackle and the shape getting larger in the screen. It looked like a person. It moved like a person. But there was something wrong with the proportions. Arms too long, head tilted at an angle that didn't make sense, limbs bending in places where joints shouldn't be. It reached the surface of the screen and kept coming. The glass didn't break, it didn't shatter or crack or make any sound at all. The figure just pushed through, like the screen was water, like it was a membrane between two worlds, and this thing had finally found a way to cross. I watched a hand emerge first, long fingers, too many knuckles, skin that wasn't skin but something darker, something that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, then an arm, then a shoulder. That's when my body finally unlocked. I threw the holy water. The bottle was still in my hands, and I hurled it without thinking, without aiming, just desperate to put something between me and the thing crawling out of my television. The plastic hit the screen and burst open, water spraying across the glass, and the figure jerked back like it had been burned. A sound filled the room. Not a scream, not quite. More like feedback, like a microphone too close to a speaker, a shriek of static that made my eardrums feel like they were bleeding. The shape in the screen convulsed, twisted, seemed to fold in on itself. For 1 second I thought I'd won, thought the holy water had actually worked, like in some old horror movie. Then the TV exploded, glass everywhere. I threw my arms up to protect my face and felt fragments bite into my forearms, my hands, the exposed skin above my collar. The static sound cut off abruptly, replaced by ringing silence, and when I lowered my arms, the TV was dead. Shattered screen, smoking slightly, sparks popping from somewhere inside the ruined casing. The room was dark now, the only light coming from the kitchen behind me, and the faint glow of streetlights through the basement windows. I stood there, blood dripping from a dozen small cuts, and waited for the shadow to reappear. It didn't. Not right away, at least. I grabbed my phone, my keys, my wallet, the essentials, the things you take when you're running, and headed for the door. I didn't care about my lease anymore. Didn't care about my deposit or my furniture or anything else in that apartment. I just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else. Somewhere that thing couldn't reach me. I made it 3 steps before the lights went out. All of them. Kitchen, hallway, the little nightlight I kept plugged in by the bathroom. Even the glow from the streetlights outside seemed to dim, like something was pressing against the windows from outside, blocking the light. I stood in absolute darkness, my phone clutched in my hand, and felt it. The presence. It was everywhere now, not behind the TV, not in the corner, not localized to any single spot. It was in the walls, in the ceiling, in the floor beneath my feet and the air I was breathing. I could feel it pressing against me from all sides, could feel something like breath on the back of my neck even though nothing was there. Nothing could be there. And then the whispers started again. Dozens of them this time. Hundreds, maybe. Overlapping, contradicting. Some loud and some barely audible. Filling my head with sounds that weren't quite words. I pressed my hands over my ears, and it didn't help. I squeezed my eyes shut, and I could still feel it watching me. Could feel its attention like a physical weight. My legs gave out, and I sank to my knees on the floor of my own apartment, surrounded by darkness and voices that wouldn't stop. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Minutes, maybe. It felt like hours. The whispers washed over me in waves, rising and falling, and I started to catch fragments, not meaning, exactly, but emotion. Hunger. Loneliness. A want so deep and old it made my chest ache. It wanted me, not to hurt me, I realized, to keep me. The thought was somehow worse than violence. I forced myself to move, hands and knees first, crawling toward where I thought the door was, my phone dead in my pocket now because of course it was. The darkness was so complete, I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed, but I kept moving, kept pushing forward, and eventually my hand hit the door frame. I pulled myself up, found the knob, twisted. The door didn't open. I pulled harder, both hands now, putting my whole weight into it. The knob turned, but the door didn't budge, like something was holding it from the other side, or like the door had never been meant to open at all, like I'd been sealed in here from the moment I signed the lease. The whispers got louder, closer. I could feel something behind me now, something standing inches away, and the temperature dropped so fast, my breath came out in clouds. I don't know what made me say it. I'm not religious, never have been. But the words came out anyway, torn from somewhere deep in my chest. Leave me alone. Not a prayer, a command. I said it again, louder this time, putting every ounce of fear and rage I had into my voice. Leave me alone. The whispers stopped. The presence pulled back. I felt it retreat, felt the pressure ease, felt the air in my lungs come a little easier, and the door clicked. Just a soft sound, barely audible, but I heard it. I grabbed the knob and twisted, and this time it opened, spilling me out into the stairwell that led up to ground level. I ran, up the stairs, out the side door, across the lawn, and into the street. I didn't stop until I was 3 blocks away, standing under a streetlight in my socks because I hadn't even grabbed shoes, shaking so hard I could barely stand. I looked back at the house, at Mr. Brennan's house, at the small basement windows that marked my apartment, and I swear I saw something in those windows, a shape, a darkness, watching me from behind the glass. Then it was gone, and there was nothing but empty windows and the faint glow of the kitchen light I'd left on, which was somehow working again. I didn't go back that night. I showed up at Caitlin's apartment around 1 a.m., barefoot and bleeding, and barely coherent. She took one look at me and pulled me inside without asking questions, sat me down on her couch, and started cleaning the cuts on my arms with antiseptic and cotton balls. I told her everything. Not the edited version, not the half-joking anecdote. Everything. From the first flicker of movement behind the TV to the thing that had crawled out of the static and tried to trap me in my own apartment. She listened without interrupting, her face cycling through confusion, concern, and something that might have been fear. When I finished, she didn't tell me I was crazy. She just asked what I wanted to do. I didn't know. I couldn't think past the immediate relief of being somewhere safe, somewhere with lights that worked and air that didn't feel like it was watching me. Caitlin let me crash on her couch that night, and the next night, and the night after that. She didn't push me to explain further or try to rationalize what I'd told her. She just made sure I had blankets and tea and someone to sit with when the dark started pressing in. I went back to the apartment exactly once during the middle of the day with Caitlin and her boyfriend Marcus as backup. The place looked normal, disturbingly normal actually. The TV was still there, still shattered, glass scattered across the floor, but there was no presence, no watching feeling, no whispers in the walls. just a sad little basement apartment with a broken television and a lingering smell of burnt plastic. I packed what I could in 20 minutes. Clothes, toiletries, laptop, the few things I actually cared about. Left everything else, the furniture, the kitchen stuff, the life I'd tried to build in that space. Mr. Brennan watched from his porch as we carried boxes to Caitlin's car. He didn't say anything, didn't ask what had happened or why I was leaving. Just watched with that unreadable expression I'd seen before, the one that made me think he knew more than he was telling. I broke my lease, ate the fees, maxed out a credit card I'd just finished paying off, and told myself it was worth it. Some debts are better than the alternative. It took me a long time to feel safe again. Weeks of sleeping with the lights on, of flinching at shadows, of checking behind every television I encountered, like something might be waiting there. I stayed with Caitlin for almost a month before I found a new place, a third-floor apartment with big windows and no basement, in a building constructed in 2015. Modern, bright. Nothing older than a decade, nothing with history, nothing that could have accumulated the kind of darkness I'd felt in that basement. The nightmares faded eventually. The hypervigilance dulled. I started sleeping through the night again, started watching TV without keeping one eye on the space behind the screen. Life went back to something resembling normal, the way it does when you survive something terrible and have no choice but to keep going. But I never forgot. I did some research after I'd recovered enough to face it, dug deeper into the history of Mr. Brennan's house, talked to a few people in the neighborhood who'd lived there long enough to remember things. What I found wasn't definitive. Nothing that would prove what I experienced was real. But it was enough to make me feel less alone. There had been other tenants in that basement. At least 6 in the 10 years before I moved in. All of them young women living alone. All of them breaking their leases early and leaving without explanation. One of them had been hospitalized for a nervous breakdown. Another had moved across the country and refused to talk about her time in that apartment, even to her own family. A third had simply disappeared. Stopped showing up to work. Stopped answering her phone. Left all her belongings behind like she'd walked out one day and never come back. No one had connected the dots. Why would they? Tenants leave for all kinds of reasons. Young women have mental health crises, change their minds, decide to start over somewhere new. There was nothing to suggest that apartment was anything other than what it appeared to be, a cheap basement rental in a quiet neighborhood. But I knew. I knew what had driven those women out. I knew what had broken them, haunted them, maybe even taken one of them entirely. And I knew that whatever lived in that darkness behind the TV, whatever had tried to keep me, was still there, waiting, patient, hungry for the next person who needed a cheap place to live and didn't ask too many questions. I thought about reporting it, going to the police or the housing authority or anyone who might be able to shut that apartment down. But what would I say? What could I prove? I had no evidence, no recordings, no photographs, nothing but a shattered TV and a collection of cuts that had healed into faint scars on my forearms. The kind of story I had to tell wasn't the kind that got taken seriously. It was the kind that got you a psych evaluation and a note in your permanent record. So I stayed quiet, moved on with my life, tried not to think about Mr. Brennan putting up a new "for rent" sign, tried not to imagine some other girl scrolling through apartment listings and seeing that suspiciously cheap basement unit, tried not to picture her moving in with her second-hand furniture and her background noise habits and her complete ignorance of what was waiting for her in the dark. I still can't sleep in silence. That hasn't changed. But I use white noise apps now, rain sounds and ocean waves and ambient coffee shop chatter. Nothing with a screen. Nothing that could become a doorway. Sometimes, late at night when the rain is falling and the white noise is filling my room, I think I hear something underneath it. A whisper, maybe. A voice that doesn't belong to the recording. It's probably nothing. Probably just my brain filling in patterns where none exist, the same way it filled in monsters behind the TV. Probably, but I keep my television unplugged anyway. Keep it facing the wall, screen turned away from my bed, like that might make a difference if something decided to push through again. I know it's irrational. I know that if something wanted to reach me badly enough, a turned screen wouldn't stop it. I just can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, still waiting. That somewhere in the static between channels, in the dark space behind every screen, something remembers me. Something I escaped from but never really left behind. The shadow that moved behind my TV is still moving somewhere. I'm sure of it. I just hope it's not moving toward me,